Assalamu alaikum. Hello, everyone. Welcome to this webinar, the second webinar in the T20 summit season. My name is Aisha Al-Sarihi. I am a T20 Task Force Coordinator for Climate Change and Environment. Thanks for joining us. This is the last webinar for the Task Force 2, which concludes a long year process which covered a series of events as well as exchange of knowledge and collaboration between authors and scholars from different think tanks around the world. I would like to kick off today's webinar by inviting the president of CAPSARC to give an opening remark for today. Adam, the mic is yours.
Thank you, Aisha. Welcome to everybody, and thank you very much to everybody at KF Chris, King Faisal Center, and at CAPSARC, who's been working so hard coordinating the activities of the Think 20, the T20. I just wanted to say what an honor it has been for all of us involved in this to have the opportunity to meet with all of the think tanks and receive all of the papers that have been done. And I want to particularly thank Fahd Al-Turki, who has been the chair of the T20 for the tremendous effort that he has put into organizing and coordinating the incredible positive amount of work that's being done by the T20. So I also wanted to say a particular thank you to my good friend Toyoda-san for the IEEJ, the International Energy Economics Association in Japan, for all of the cooperation that we've received from them today. So with that, over to you, Fahd, or back to you, Aisha.
Thank you very much, Adam. The next speaker that we have for today, I'm pleased to invite the lead co-chair of Task Force 2 on Climate Change and Environment, Dr. Noura Mansouri, to give the opening remarks for today's webinar. Before doing that, I would like to introduce Dr. Noura Mansouri, who is currently a research fellow at King Abdullah Petroleum Studies and Research Center and a research affiliate at the MIT, an observer and expert at the World Energy Council. By working in many energy-focused international organizations, including the MIT, the Center for Global Energy Studies in London, Dr. Mansouri has accumulated 15 years of research and professional experience in energy and sustainable economic transition, carbon capture and storage, renewable energy, sustainable desalination, and optimization of water use in the agriculture sector. She is an author of a book titled Greening the Black Gold, Saudi Arabia Quest for Clean Energy. Mansouri earned her MBA and PhD from Queen Mary University of London. Dr. Noura is a recipient of many awards, including the 2015 Women Excellence Leadership Award. She is also a member of global committees, including the Review and Selection Committee for the Zaid Sustainability Prize, and a board member at Women in Clean Energy under the Clean Energy Business Council for the Middle East and North Africa. I would like now to transfer the mic to you, Noura.
Thank you very much, Aisha. Welcome to the T20 Summit Season Task Force 2 webinar on climate change and environment. Tomorrow marks the 90th Saudi National Day. I would like to take this opportunity to congratulate my country and its leadership, His Majesty King Salman bin Abdulaziz Al Saud, and His Royal Highness Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman bin Abdulaziz Al Saud, and the Saudi people, wishing them all further progress towards a future of prosperity, sustainability, and inclusion. It gives me great pleasure to welcome you all virtually. passing the legacy from Japan to Saudi Arabia and extending it to Italy and India, the consecutive G20, T20 hosts, honored to have all countries' representations here today in this concluding webinar, concluding a year-long journey of developing 24 policy briefs written by 164 authors and collaborators from 26 countries from all over the world on pressing global climate change and environmental issues that beg for action by the G20 governments, now published online on the T20 Saudi Arabia website, which aims to support G20 climate change and environmental policy making, inform the public on policy options that the G20 could use to address global climate change and environmental challenges, and facilitate policy advocacy through profoundly argued, concrete, and implementable policy recommendations. Congratulations and thanks to all our valuable members for this very important and impressive work to advance the global climate change and environment agenda in these post-COVID-19 uncertain and challenging times. After a rewarding journey of many tireless days, sleepless nights, countless calls, conflicts resolved, partnerships formed, and friendships forged, maintaining the hard work with admirable commitment, with devotion to family and loved ones in the middle of a pandemic, showing such extraordinary courage and incredible resilience in the face of adversity, proving that the human capacity for burden is beyond measure and far more than we believe. There is so much resilience in nature that we can learn from. This natural wonder that is planet Earth, our common home, our shared responsibility. In ecology, resilience is defined as the capacity of an ecosystem to respond to a disturbance by resisting damage and recovering quickly. There is so much that we can learn, especially facing the unprecedented COVID-19 pandemic and its aftermath. Nature can heal itself if we allow it to do so. There are many stunning examples from around the world on how the environment was able to heal during the lockdowns. The industrial pollutions have cleared over China. Air pollution was reduced in 90 cities in India. The marvelous Himalayas were now visible for the first time in 30 years. The evolutionary resilience of biodiversity has restored life. Oceans are both the greatest victims of climate change and its greatest mitigators, including the hidden forests of salt marshes, mangroves, seagrass meadows, and kelp forests that act as natural carbon sinks, as well as the giant humpback whale and its ability to capture carbon and sink it to the ocean floor after its death. Biodiversity is the foundation of life and sustainable development. Nature provides our food, water, and air. It is the most precious thing we have and need to preserve. However, through increased pollution, as well as megatrends such as rapid population growth, the impacts of climate change, coupled with other anthropogenic environmental pressures, further accentuate the problem, which creates a vicious cycle that ultimately impacts our livelihood. Destroyed habitats may create the perfect conditions for pandemics to emerge. Ironically, tackling climate change, the implementation of international agreements, and new biodiversity goals post-2020 may now be delayed or compromised altogether. COVID-19 has led to the cancellation of both Climate COP26 and Biodiversity COP15. Hence, the G20, especially this year, must fill the gap in effective multilateralism. The G20 has long addressed the climate change and environment agenda. G20's 2020 Riyadh Summit includes nature in its priority of safeguarding the planet, and in its goal of managing emissions for sustainable development and combating land degradation and habitat loss, providing highly supportive synergies. The G20 has the potential to lead the international community in working toward minimizing land degradation and deforestation to conserve biodiversity and meet climate goals. G20 members include the world's largest fossil fuels producers and consumers. How G20 member countries prevent carbon produced by fossil fuels accumulating in the atmosphere will determine whether the world stays below the Paris Agreement's warming threshold. The Saudi G20 presidency is proposing the circular carbon economy as an integrated and inclusive approach to transition towards more comprehensive, resilient, sustainable, and climate-friendly energy system, which offers a new way of approaching climate goals that embraces all options and encourages all efforts to mitigate carbon accumulation in the atmosphere. Achieving SDG 13 on climate action and the Paris Agreement's target of limiting the average global temperature rise to below 2 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels, let alone its aspirational target of limiting this rise to 1.5 degrees Celsius with minimum stranded assets within an orderly energy transition, requires the inclusion of all energy options, such as expanding the use of renewable energy, supporting nuclear energy, advancing hydrogen, as well as ensuring the participation of hard-to-abate industries by supporting carbon management technologies and transitioning towards carbon circularity and neutrality. We must see the COVID-19 crisis as a lesson in how to address climate change quickly and cooperatively. Coordinated G20 efforts are vital in pursuing this goal. Post-pandemic economic recovery stimulus packages should not derail climate actions and must utilize a circular carbon economy framework to simultaneously address social and environmental concerns while stimulating economic prosperity for a more inclusive and sustainable future. I would like us to start with this proverb: we do not inherit the earth from our ancestors. We borrow it from our children. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Noura. It is a great pleasure to have Mr. Amar Bhattacharya to give the keynote speech for today's webinar. Mr. Amar Bhattacharya is a senior fellow at the Global Economy and Development Program at Brookings Institute and a co-lead of the Sustainable Growth and Finance Initiative of a New Climate Economy under the Global Commission on the Economy and Climate. His focus areas are the global economy, development finance, global governance, and the link between climate and development, including on the role of sustainable infrastructure. Mr. Bhattacharya had a long-standing career in the World Bank, and between 2007 and 2014, he was director of the Group of 24, which is an international group of developing country finance ministers and central bank governors. In his capacity, he was the focal point for the bank's engagement with key international groupings and institutions such as the G7, G8, G20, IMF, OECD, and the Commonwealth Secretariat. He completed his undergraduate at the University of Delhi and Brandeis University, and his graduate education at Princeton University. Mr. Amar, I would like to give the mic to you. Thank you.
Thank you. I hope you can hear me. So let me begin by thanking Dr. Noura Mansouri and Dr. Fahd Al-Turki and the Institute of Energy Economics of Japan. I also wanted to congratulate Noura and all Saudis on your National Day, and also to congratulate not just the co-chairs, but the entire team of Task Force 2 for the tremendous work that you have done this year, and the very, very seminal work on the circular carbon economy and the blue carbon economy. So I'm going to make a presentation, and I'm going to use a slide presentation as a discipline because I have quite a lot of ground to cover, and I thought that way I will make sure that I do it effectively and also leave the audience with something tangible. So if you can, Jitendra, upload the presentation, the cover page. So this is that I'm going to talk about climate action in the aftermath of COVID-19 pandemic, building on the really inspiring words of Dr. Mansouri. And I'm going to base this on joint work that I have been doing over several years with Professor Nicholas Stern of LSE. So slide 2. So the structure of my presentation is in 3 parts. The first one is, the first thing that I'm going to do is talk about a strategy for better recovery, and beyond that, sustainable and inclusive, and I should add resilient growth. The second, I want to highlight the scale of the challenge we face and the opportunities that come from investment and innovation at this point in time, and then what kind of actions we need, focusing on policies, institutions, and finance. So slide 3 basically makes very clear that we are off track. If we take a look at the NDC commitments that have been made in aggregate, it does not get us anywhere near the 2-degree goal. And if we want to get to the 2-degree goal, we will have to cut emissions very significantly. And if we want to get to the 1.5-degree goal even more quickly, that's the main message I would leave. Second, climate change is already upon us. And if you look at slide 4, you see that the science of climate change is clear, and that the differences between 1.5 degrees and 2 degrees are really very significant, not just in terms of impact in the sense of extreme heat and violent climate events, as we are seeing from Australia to California to everywhere, with tropical storms, but also the secular change, the tipping points, the number of sea ice-free Arctic summers, and especially, as Noura had pointed out, the loss, the permanent loss of biodiversity. So we are really, as she pointed out, at a historic moment in time. If you go to slide 5, you see exactly the point that she was making about the present pandemic. So if you look at the pandemic, you will see that the amount of decline in emissions this time is much, much greater than any previous economic crisis that the world has seen. And that does provide us an opportunity not only to see clear skies and pollution-free air, but also to put ourselves on a better emissions trajectory if we build back better. And that's a very important if. So if you go to slide 6, so we all know that the impact and the implications of the COVID pandemic has been of an order of magnitude, something that we have never seen. The world has been transformed by the COVID-19 crisis. There has been tragic loss of human life, tremendous suffering in terms of livelihoods, but the outlook is also very uncertain. We are in uncharted territory. A fast bounce back cannot be guaranteed. And the recovery has highlighted the dangers and the fragilities of the past. As again, Dr. Mansouri pointed out, the world was on an unsustainable and vulnerable path, and the crisis offers us the opportunity to get on a better path. The economic impacts are particularly severe on emerging and developing countries. And that comes through many channels. I don't want to dwell on that, but it is very clear with every passing day that both the impact, also the capacity to respond of emerging markets and developing countries significantly worse, say, compared to the 2008-2009 crisis. So we have an imperative, slide 7, to build back better. The dangers involved in climate change are still bigger than the COVID crisis. They have not gone away. And we must not go back to the old normal. It was deeply fragile and deeply dangerous. We face a major risk of world depression, and that's important to keep in mind, because actually strong climate action at this point in time is not just good for the climate, it can be good for jobs, and it can be good for a strong recovery. Some of these ideas are laid out in a paper that we prepared for the Coalition of Finance Ministers on Climate Action, and that is referred to at the bottom of the slide. So what are the priorities post-COVID? So the first thing is we have to avoid retrograde steps. And unfortunately, that's not always the case right now, as I'll highlight a little later. But the second thing is, beyond the stabilization phase, we have to anticipate a recovery, that a strong recovery, a better recovery, a green recovery, and that recovery has to be a segue to long-term transformation. And in order to do that, we need 3 elements. We have to prepare a coherent strategy for the right investments. We have to have the supporting policies, and we have to ensure that finance is available and is aligned with sustainability. As the work of the task force has shown, a circular carbon economy and a blue carbon economy can make an important and timely contribution to building back better and to long-term transformation. So slide 9, as I mentioned, acting strongly on climate and on a low carbon transition is the growth story of the 21st century. It produces the strength, the sustainability, and the inclusion we need. In 5 to 10 years, it provides a major boost through investment. That investment, in turn, can build in the longer term human capital, wealth, and well-being for all. It is also the foundation for a more innovative future of creativity, a Schumpeterian process that extends itself. And ultimately, in the long term, it is the only sustainable path. Any other path will collapse on its own weight. So we have to remember this is not just about climate, it is actually the growth story of the future. And the question is how fast we get on the path. If you go to slide 10, so the point here is the great urgency. The next decade is absolutely critical for the world. Why? Because the stock of infrastructure will double during that period, because the world economy will double, and because we are in an unprecedented moment in history with regard to urbanization. And then, so the choices made on infrastructure and capital now will either lock us into high emissions or set us on a path for low carbon and resilient and sustainable growth. And in all of this, we should keep in mind that that investment in cities will be particularly important. So the next slide, slide 11, the scale of investment and innovation. So we have to keep in mind that as we look to the future, we have to have a better balance between all forms of capital. Sustainable growth will be driven by the quality and quantity of investments in natural capital, human capital, social capital, and physical capital, and recognize the interactions and complementarities between these 4 will be fundamental. Investing in all of these 4 capitals in a balanced way will be crucial in achieving net zero and resilience. So if you go to the next slide, which is slide 13, basically sustainable infrastructure is at the heart of the story. It is the foundation for inclusive growth. It is what provides both sustainability, including climate, and it empowers people. And the scale of the challenge on infrastructure, as is well known, is basically a requirement of a doubling of the investment in infrastructure over the coming decade or two in order to transform capital, to make the existing stock of capital fit for purpose, to anticipate future capital needs for growth and sustainability, to adapt to climate change, and to build resilience. In order to do this, slide 14, we will need transformation across key systems: energy, transport, water, and digital, and across cities. There are huge and attractive opportunities. Good policy turns these investment opportunities into real projects, and we need to take the tremendous amount of savings in the world and use it for good purpose in financing these investments, recognizing, though, that these are very long-term investments. At the present time, it's not just a question of green investments, but investments that have important multipliers, including labor-intensive and not import-intensive investments at this point in time. It turns out that green investments meet these criteria very strongly, and they have very, very powerful long-term multipliers, as we are beginning to understand and see. Slide 17, unfortunately, so far, the initial spending of the world has not been very green. The exception has been the European Green Deal package and the European Recovery Program, but elsewhere, as you can see, we have not got off to the start that we need, and I hope the last panel will focus very much on how we turn the ship around. Last part of my presentation on the importance of policies, institutions, and finance. Slide 19, please. So we have, several filters that countries and governments can use to ensure that the investment spending that we are doing right now is actually green and more than green. The OECD has something called a well-being lens, which allows us to look at investments in the broadest of ways to support inclusive and sustainable growth and well-being of people. We are putting in a lot of effort on green budgeting, including through the work of the Coalition of Finance Ministers. The World Bank has prepared project-level guidance and checklists. There are important sector-level guidance that we can use, and everywhere there is a need to focus more on resilience, and this goes beyond mitigation and consider all investments through a resilience lens. Slide 20. It's very important that we have a supportive policy framework. The fiscal context in particular will be very important. And there are three dimensions that have come to the fore as a result of COVID that I want to highlight: the timeliness and the potential for elimination of fossil fuel subsidies and for carbon prices. This is a great time. The G20 has committed to this, but this is a very timely situation to accelerate that. The importance of complementary regulations and standards that are particularly valuable in a time of crisis. Green public procurement can also play a very important role, and we must prevent a rollback of regulations and standards. Finally, bailout conditionalities, especially in countries that have very large bailout packages, including support from central bank. One dimension in slide 21 that I want to highlight is how this transition is managed in terms of transition and in terms of impact will be on people, will be central to building consensus for strong, sustainable economies. Entire economies and people will be affected by the transition. And Saudi Arabia, of course, is a prime example of that. So we have to keep in mind the just transition, how we help countries adjust and how we help people adjust. For that, we have to focus on lifelong learning, on skills development, on relocation, and on social protection. Slide 22. Last but not least, we need to focus on finance. We are at an extraordinarily difficult position with regard to finance, and especially with finance in emerging markets and developing countries. Public balance sheets are extremely stretched at a time when vulnerability is extremely high. Moreover, IFI, the International Financial Institution, balance sheets will be extremely stretched. They have to provide financing right now for rescue packages. The question that arises is, will they have the firepower for recovery? And beyond that, will they have the firepower to support sustained transformation? The IMF has stepped up tremendously, but there is and the MDBs have committed something like 160 billion over the next 12 to 18 months. But the question is, will we have the firepower in the balance sheets of the governments? Will we have the firepower in the IFIs to undertake the recovery and transformation? And how do we, in some sense, bring the private sector to the table? Climate finance will be a very important part of this. I am co-leading a group for the Secretary General that's looking at the 100 billion, and it's extremely important that the 100 billion be delivered, not in 2020, but as quickly as possible. Let me close next slide 23 by making a very simple point which is not recognized, and that is the tremendous power of the multilateral development banks. An infusion of just, I'm closing, an infusion of just 38 billion into the system will allow us to increase lending by 1 trillion a year. And my last slide, can this be done? Yes, it can. We have 4 extraordinarily opportune forces, extraordinary low interest rates in the world for some time to come, rapid technological change, international agreements and broad engagements, and the power of youth. So I leave you with a note of optimism. We can get it done, and I hope the rest of the panel will elaborate on the opportunities that we have. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Amar Bhattacharya, for the insightful remarks. Now we will move in the next 2 hours. We will move into panel discussions. The first panel for today is focused on circular carbon economy, and it will be moderated by Dr. Noura Mansouri, the lead co-chair of the Task Force 2 on the Climate Change and Environment, and a research fellow at King Abdullah Petroleum Studies and Research Center. Dr. Noura, the mic is yours.
Thank you, Aisha. I would like to welcome you all to the Circular Carbon Economy panel. Meeting climate targets necessitates the inclusion of all sectors, including the hard-to-abate sectors, which makes up nearly a third of carbon emissions. G20 governments represent the largest producers and consumers of fossil fuels. Utilizing the circular carbon economy approach enables the transition of these carbon-intensive industries towards carbon circularity and neutrality by the second half of the century. Embracing all energy technologies under the 4 R's of circular carbon economy is important to reduce, reuse, recycle, and remove carbon. This panel discusses the circular carbon economy as an essential mean to a low-carbon future through coordinated G20 efforts towards supporting carbon management technology innovations. It gives me great pleasure to welcome the panelists. Professor Masakazo Toyoda. Professor Toyoda has been the chairman and CEO since 2010 at the Institute of Energy Economics, Japan, which has been ranked among top 3 energy and resource policy think tanks for 6 consecutive years in Global Go-To Think Tank Index reports by the University of Pennsylvania. In addition, as a member of Strategic Policy Committee of Agency for Natural Resources and Energy Ministry of Economy, Trade and Industry of Japan, he contributed compiling the 5th Strategic Energy Plan, which was approved by the Cabinet in July 2018. Making good use of these experiences, he lectures about energy study as an adjunctive professor at the National Graduate Institute for Policy Studies in Tokyo. He also serves as an international advisor to a number of institutions such as the Brunei National Energy Research Institute, CAPSARC, the Oxford Institute for Energy Studies, and the Pacific International Center for High Technology Research Center. Since 2019, he has been one of commission members of the International Energy Agency's Global Commission for Urgent Action on Energy Efficiency. Prior to joining the IEEJ, he served at the Ministry of Economy, Trade and Industry of Japan, where he held prominent positions, namely Vice Minister of International Affairs. Second, we have Dr. Adnan Shihabuddin. Dr. Shihabuddin is the Director General of the Kuwait Foundation for the Advancement of Sciences. He has held several leadership positions at international institutions, including Director of Research and Acting Secretary General of OPIC, and director positions at both the IAEA and UNESCO. He also served as Director General of Kuwait Institute for Scientific Research and as the Vice Rector for Academic Affairs at the Kuwait University. Dr. Shihabuddin serves as a board member of numerous public and private organizations, companies, and foundations. He has published extensive research papers, book chapters, and articles in the field of energy, nuclear science, and socio-economic development, and is often invited to speak at international meetings on these and other related topics. Dr. Shihabuddin received his BSc, MSc, and PhD degrees from the University of California, Berkeley. He has received many prestigious awards, including the 2017 Elise and Walter A. Haas International Award. Third, we have Dr. Paul Zakur. Dr. Paul Zakur is a director of the consultancy Carbon Counts and a visiting researcher at CAPSARC. Paul has more than 17 years of experience in the field of climate change policy, regulation, and economics. Among other work, Paul advised on the design of European CCS regulations in 2008, 2007, and 2008, and on the UNFCCC's CCS rules under the Clean Development Mechanism in 2010 and 2011. Paul holds a PhD in environmental technology from Imperial College London. A pleasure to have you all esteemed panelists with us today. I would like to kick off the discussion with a question to Professor Toyoda. Could you please tell us what is the importance of the circular carbon economy approach?
Noura, thank you very much for your kind introduction. My name is Kazu Toyoda, Chairman and CEO of Institute of Energy Economics Japan. It is a great pleasure to join the concluding webinar of T20 as CEO of co-hosting institute. And as one of the participants in the discussion and the compilation of the paper on carbon management Task Force 2 under T20. Today, yes, I like to respond two questions first, and then the third question which I made. First, why CCE approach, circular carbon economy approach is important. Second, what are some key technologies for neutral hydrocarbon specifically? And then what are the challenges in realizing circular carbon economy, and what could be solution? The first question, why CCE approach is important? The simple answer is that no energy is perfect. from the standpoint of so-called 3E, energy security, economic growth, and environment. And we cannot cope with climate change unless we have a new way of thinking, the sustainable use of hydrocarbon, which is the essence of CCE. At this moment, we have only two kinds of zero carbon energy available, renewable energy and nuclear. They are indeed important, but unfortunately, neither of them is perfect to address climate change. Regarding nuclear energy, the entry barrier is not necessarily low in terms of technology, and the public acceptance is another challenge, even when you succeed to start using it. The share of nuclear energy in the world primary energy is currently 5%. And 10% by 2050 is not an easy task. With respect to renewable energy, the cost is substantially declining. It's a good news, but there are two possible difficulties. First, availability of renewable energy depends on the countries and regions, since weather conditions and geographical conditions are not necessarily the same. Therefore, capacity factors, power generation costs differ, and I have to say that there are rich and poor countries in terms of endowment of renewable energy. Regrettably, Japan and many Southeastern Asian countries seem to belong to this poor group. Second, solar and wind power are intermittent energy, and backup is necessitated. However, system costs will increase rather rapidly when the share of intermittent energy goes beyond a certain level, 40% or 50%, particularly if you try to use battery or green hydrogen for backup. In short, circular carbon economy is trying to manage CO2 by carbon neutralizing hydrocarbon, and not only to prevent CO2 from increasing, but also to reduce CO2 eventually to zero in the economic system. According to the environmental innovation strategy published by Japanese government this January, the currently emitted CO2 is about 50 billion tons, but we could reduce CO2 emission up to zero or even negative with those 4R related technology. Among them, contribution by hydrocarbon related technology would amount to around 1/2 or 50%. The second question, what are some key technologies for—
Thank you very much, Professor Toyoda, for this
Yes.
great, great presentation. We'll take the second question in the second round, if you don't mind.
Yes.
And we'll move on to Dr. Adnan Shihabuddin.
Okay, okay,
with
that's
the
fine.
question on the prospects of carbon neutral hydrogen. If I may ask you to elaborate on the prospects of carbon neutral hydrogen, Dr. Adnan.
Thank you very much, and thank you for the invitation and for also your kind introduction. And I'm delighted to be joining such a distinguished panel with my good friends. And congratulations on the success of the T20, and also hopefully the G20 will conclude under the presidency of the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia with great success. But in answer to your question, the prospect for carbon neutral or clean hydrogen probably is, as I understand the question correctly. And what we know now in the last few years is that Dr. Toyoda highlighted, and also the keynote speaker highlighted, the importance of finding every solution that could lead us to zero emission or negative emission, hopefully by 2050 or early. And hydrogen is one of those most ideal for that, and for two reasons. One, it can be generated either from renewables, and that's called green hydrogen, or it can be generated from the dominant energy sources currently, the fossil energy sources, and that's currently called brown hydrogen. But with CCS, capturing the CO2 when you're generating the hydrogen from the fossil fuels, variety of techniques, you end up with a blue hydrogen with essentially very little, if any, CO2 emission. And that's ideal carrier of energy. It can be as an energy storage, it can be as an energy carrier, and it can serve in so many applications. It can be used in power, it can be used in mobility, it can be used to decarbonize some of the most difficult industries, steel and so on. And therefore, there has been now a renewed interest as part of the commitment toward zero emission mid-century in order to achieve the 2 degrees threshold, not to exceed it, and maybe the inspiration of 1.5. And what does it mean that? It means we're starting from today where hydrogen production, dedicated hydrogen production is about 70 million tons. There are estimates that it could actually multiply by a factor of 7 by 2050. There is demand potential by a factor of 7, over 500, maybe more than a factor of 7. And that could serve mainly industrial feedstock, mobility, power generation, and other applications. The only issue right now is the cost. The cost currently for what's called brown hydrogen with no CCS coming from fossil fuels is around $1, approximately $1 or so per kilogram of hydrogen. If you add CCS, the cost currently goes to about $1.50, give and take a little bit. If you try to produce hydrogen from renewable wind and solar when it's available, then it goes up to $6 and maybe $8 currently. So the challenge in order to fulfill this prospect that I've just pointed out would be to try to cut down the cost. And here you're going to see the following. You're going to see accelerated dropping in the cost of green hydrogen driven by policy, especially in the European Union and other countries that are averse to other sources of carbon neutral hydrogen. But also there are many countries that are looking at both blue and green and recognizing that blue hydrogen is the transition within the energy transition, is the transition to fully fledged green hydrogen, maybe sometime around 2050, 2060, we don't know. And the cost will be competing, but the green hydrogen cost coming down from about $6 or $8 per kilogram down to about $1, $1.50 in today's cost is going to happen probably, but it's not going to happen before 2030, 2040, when it will overtake, potentially overtake, unless there are barriers. However, blue hydrogen is currently available at $1.50, so it's not going to be that difficult. If you push the CCS and invest in the CCS with the fossil fuel countries like Saudi Arabia and the Gulf and others, Australia, what have you, you can really satisfy the demand coming from countries such as Japan, Germany, the Netherlands, the European Union, and what have you. But that requires policies. That requires investments and policies. So the prospects are there. They are real. Hydrogen is going to be really the sort of the golden star of the energy, the gold star of the energy 20, 30 years from now, just like oil has been. But actually its ancestor could be oil, gas, coal, or green. And all of them can play in a role. And we don't know exactly what will be the roles 20, 30, 40 years from now, but we know what are the roles right now. I will stop here.
Thank you very much, Dr. Adnan, for this great summary on the prospects of hydrogen, especially in how they address the across the 4 R's of the circular carbon economy in reducing, reusing, recycling, and removing carbon through the industrial supply chain, as well as using different energy sources. I would like to bring in the discussion Dr. Paul Zakur, and building on really this beautiful buildup of arguments on where we are today in the world, what are the prospects, how can we meet the climate targets given the realities of renewables, nuclear, the clean energy options, and the fossil fuel-based world energy system. Could you please talk about the innovative proposal which you have proposed in your policy brief? What are the carbon sinks that you are describing, which you propose as a supply-side solution to climate change?
Yeah, thanks, Noura, and thanks for the invitation to talk about our policy brief at this very exclusive and influential platform. And really, what I'm going to talk about is our policy brief builds on some work that we already developed over the last 2 years with CAPSARC, and it's very much about the starting point is to say, well, how can we decarbonize fossil fuel value chains? And we have a system in place today where all of the incentive is applied on the on the downstream user of the fossil fuel, which leaves very little scope for the upstream suppliers of fuel to actually take control in decarbonizing the value chains of their products. So that was our starting point. And the second element of that is to think, how can we build a system or an accounting approach that not only looks at offsets against emissions, but thinking about offsetting against carbon production. So we have on the one side, on the user side, we have carbon emissions, and on the supplier side, we have carbon production. So our idea or our conceptual framework is built around a supply side approach that looks at carbon production and looking at offsets through sequestration, so we can look at equilibrating carbon extraction and carbon injection in a synthesized approach upstream of where the fuel supply is used. So essentially what that allows you to do is decarbonize fuels at source by tagging them with a equivalent storage unit. This can be quite powerful for decarbonizing fossil fuels through a blue hydrogen pathway, like Dr. Adnan described, but also virtually decarbonizing conventional fossil fuels. So really the focus of the sinks is on geological storage at the current time, but also this could be potentially applied to any type of storage, depending on how the monitoring and reporting and accounting systems evolve for, say, forestry or even utilization of CO2 in products. All of these different pathways where we see CO2 going into any other repository other than the atmosphere or reservoir of carbon is the key to our proposal. And what we think is really going to be helpful in the first instance to facilitate this development is to actually establish some kind of tradable unit that measures tons of carbon stored. And this is the first part of our policy proposal, is to establish a tradable storage unit which complements not only the typical emissions units used in carbon accounting today, but can be used by suppliers to bundle with fuel supplies, for example, if it's blue hydrogen or even conventional crude oil. If you can show as a supplier that you've tagged and tracked that particular ton of carbon embodied in the crude through an equivalent action upstream to store carbon, then we can essentially call that a decarbonized fuel. And so what our policy brief talks about is firstly establishing this unit that can provide the accounting system that works in that way. And then secondly, talks a little bit more about how we can create the policy environment where these storage units have value, firstly through piloting and bilateral mechanisms, and then through, over the longer term, much more enduring mechanisms. And we see this as something really innovative and useful for countries, particularly fossil fuel exporting countries, who can then start to take more control over the climate agenda and efforts to mitigate. Because at the presently, there's very little mechanisms by which fossil fuel exporters can actually contribute significantly to Paris Agreement targets.
Thank you very much, Dr. Zakur, for this wonderful explanation on a really innovative proposal that you have put together for the G20 countries. If I can go back to Professor Toyoda and take you perhaps deeper into the discussion on circular carbon economy and the key technologies for neutral hydrocarbons. So what are the options that we have under the 4 Rs of the circular carbon economy?
Well, Noura, thank you very much. Could you show us a table which we compiled as a discussion group? Yes, maybe you could have a look at that. We have reduce, reuse, recycle, remove. So 4R. And the first R stands for reduce, reducing the amount of carbon entering into the system. Energy saving, use of renewable energy and nuclear energy are clearly categorized here. The use of the most efficient coal-fired plants, such as USC, ultra supercritical, and beyond, and the use of zero carbon hydrogen and ammonia based on hydrocarbon for power generation, transportation, and industrial fuel is also considered to be here. Someone asked a question, what is the difference between green and blue hydrogen? Green hydrogen is a renewable energy-based hydrogen with electrolysis, and blue hydrogen is hydrocarbon-based hydrogen with CCS. And so this reduce is full of ideas, full of technology. And the use, what is this? The using carbon without chemical conversion. And the use of CO2 as a resource for crops and vegetables absorbing CO2 as it is, in order to make a nutrient-rich agricultural product is categorized here. And also, when we talk about biofuel, producing jet fuel by letting reed bed absorbing CO2 is another good example here. And the recycle, this is probably new for many people, meaning recycling carbon with chemical conversion. In other words, when CO2 comes out, we use CO2 as a resource and recycle in the system. The difference between reuse and recycle is reusing CO2 with or without chemical conversion. There are many technologies being developed for industrial use of CO2 under recycling, as you see a long list of examples. One interesting example is coal ash concrete curing with absorbing CO2. When we make concrete, we reduce the use of cement and let concrete absorb CO2 as stiffener. As a result, we can harden concrete, which is being commercialized already, at least in Japan. Although the price is probably about twice higher than ordinary concrete, but it is much, much harder concrete. We expect the cost of concrete curing to go down when market expands. This technology could be further developed to be as negative carbon technology. And the final fourth R stands for remove, meaning removing carbon from the system. Everybody can guess that CCS is categorized here, and zero carbon hydrogen can be produced from hydrocarbon and be utilized for various purposes, Dr. Adnan said. And also DAC, direct air capture, which is CO2 removing technology, will be also commercialized before too long. So I hope you could have a good image of circular carbon economy type of technology for us.
Thank you very much, Professor Toyoda, for this explanation of this comprehensive portfolio of carbon management technologies that can be supported and that talks to the 4 R's of the circular carbon economy approach. If I can move to Dr. Adnan, you provided an excellent overview of the hydrogen technology, its sources, its prospects, and multiple uses across the supply chain and for energy. How can we utilize the UNFCCC and national level policies to promote neutral hydrogen technologies? If you can talk to us about the policy side of the equation.
Yeah, I'm glad. Thank you, Noura. I'm glad that you asked this question because I alluded in my earlier intervention that you need policies to realize the potential, and especially for fossil fuel producers that are moving to compete 20, 30 years from now in clean energy ecosystem. there is a potential. That potential, of course, involves many things. It involves developing the technology, investing in the development of the technology, but that's not sufficient. You need to work with the importers. And the way to do that, you have to take advantage of the existing frameworks or international agreements, such as what you alluded to, the United Nations Framework for Climate Change, UNFCCC. And within the UNFCCC in particular, the Paris Agreement allowed two types of modalities that countries can take advantage of and develop on a bilateral level. It's called cooperative approaches, whereby you develop mechanism for cooperating and exporting clean hydrogen, blue hydrogen, and where the importing countries will take that as part of its national commitment under the Paris Agreement. But in order to do that, you have to work first at the bilateral level, but then that bilateral level has to be transparent and validated at the international level. And how do you do that? How do you do that? Each two countries can work by themselves, but then it becomes very difficult. So they have to work by themselves, but at the same time, they have to make sure that the arrangement they have carried out, such as between Japan and Saudi Arabia, there is now a very concrete plan to cooperate where Saudi Arabia will be exporting some of the blue hydrogen they are planning, maybe in the form of blue ammonia, but that has to be part of a validated, monitored, transparent. So this requires that you develop these instruments, and you need an international sort of observatory monitoring. So either you set up a new system, a new organization. For example, it's been proposed in the policy brief on this subject that I participated in. It's been suggested that you could establish, for example, International Hydrogen Economy Initiative, or use IEA or IEF in Saudi Arabia for that purpose. And basically, what would they do? They would basically develop a coordinated R&D on green and blue hydrogen and initiate new demonstration projects, and they define standards for different hydrogen types, and as well as they specify what are the emission profiles coming from here to there. More importantly, if you allow me, you need to design within the country itself, and that's the second part of your question. You need to design within the country some kind of instruments to incentivize the production of blue hydrogen and ultimately even green hydrogen. And you need to test policies that you will enact. And you could, for example, you could develop, if you are talking about green hydrogen, you can talk about feed-in tariffs. You could talk about the price differentials between blue hydrogen and brown hydrogen, and how that price differential can be recognized, accepted, and becomes the basis for the transaction, financial transaction between the exporting and importing countries. Second, I think we also proposed that to the G20 countries, we proposed maybe they should think about developing what's called the lighthouse bilateral initiatives under the cooperative approaches I mentioned. So the G20 can probably be the umbrella that support establishment of these what's called lighthouse bilateral initiatives. And finally, third proposal we made is that we encourage the G20 countries, led by Saudi Arabia, to coordinate hydrogen programs, to develop baseline and monitoring methodologies for generating emission credits. Because what's important at the end is that you have to come to a common language about it, and under the international market mechanism. And this would be under Article 6.2, for example, or Article 6.4, but Article 6.2 is much easier than Article 6.4. Why? Because under the, from the Paris Agreement, under the UNFCCC, why? It is because it's much easier to work on two bilateral level and then find a way to give it acceptance. If you try to generate acceptance at the international level, which Article 6.4 allows for, then it takes much longer time. So at the bottom line, what we need to do is to work at both levels. Cooperative approaches between two countries, but not just to work between the two countries, find ways and means as we described before, so that this work will be recognized as acceptable by the international community. Second, work on an international mechanism that would allow for blue hydrogen to be really recognized and accepted. Let me just close by reiterating what I said for the producing countries. Currently they enjoy what's called a cost gap. I said the cost of blue hydrogen is only about 50% higher than than brown hydrogen, but it's 6 to 8 times for green hydrogen. That gap will not exist forever. Maybe 2030, 2040, that gap will be reduced. That means we have to work through the cooperative approaches and the international approaches under Article 6.2 and 6.4. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Adnan, for this wonderful overview on the policy options that we have, especially under the UNFCCC. I would like to conclude by bringing in Dr. Paul and ask him to please give us the summary of your priority recommendations to the G20 governments to achieve carbon neutrality by mid-century.
Yeah, I think what Dr. Adnan says is very helpful, but it's also helpful to look at that as the starting point for our proposal, because if you're going to rely on current market mechanisms to promote CCS, we're going to be waiting a very long time for carbon prices to reach the level that's going to deliver blue hydrogen with CCS at a price of $150, $200 a ton CO2 mitigation. And I think this is where we need to perhaps think about lining our ideas up a little bit better, because carbon prices are not going to deliver anything in the next 20 years that's going to deliver large-scale, significant amounts of CCS without supplementary and additional layers of policy instruments. The clearing price for Article 6 units of credits within the global carbon market, well, they'll be better than they were for CDM, but realistically, getting over $25, $30 a ton seems unlikely in the next 10 or 15 years, and we need to see action more urgently. And this is why we proposed this secondary mechanism of a storage unit that can also work through Article 6 and provide a secondary layer of finance to really help these projects come forward, come down the abatement curve, come up the IRR listing. And that's where our storage mechanism under Article 6 really starts to play a role in accelerating and bringing together not only carbon credit pricing, but also a new supply side mechanism that can complement those carbon markets, particularly when you're, for example, if Saudi Arabia wants to export blue hydrogen to Japan, Japan will get plenty of credit from using clean energy, but it won't necessarily know whether the hydrogen has come from a source where the CO2 is being geologically stored or not, unless there's some kind of indicator, a tag or a unit that can show the measured quotient of carbon stored in relation to that hydrogen produced. And this is again where our storage unit comes into play. So I think our main recommendation is, if not to strongly advocate for inclusion of this storage unit within the Article 6 negotiations, at least don't shut the door on it when we get to COP26, and we hopefully, which should happen next November, and hopefully then we can conclude the negotiations around Article 6 rules and regulations at COP26, and that should hopefully give us latitude for this storage or sequestration unit to come into play. Now, another thing to mention is also things are moving in other jurisdictions. We see California taking a similar sort of approach under the low carbon fuel standard, where a storage certificate for direct air capture can be used to offset fuel supplied under the low carbon fuel standard in the state. We're also looking at Europe now through its circular carbon economy plan to look at developing a carbon reduction certificate mechanism, and that should be with us in the mid-20s, which could be looking at something slightly similar to a storage unit and something that complements ETS market. So there is this growing recognition that we need a separate layer of incentives for storing carbon that can work in a complementary and supplementary way to reducing carbon emissions. So I really hope we can bring that thinking forward before COP26 and at least leave the door open for some further development in that sort of pathway.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Dr. Paul, for this great summary of the key recommendations of the G20 governments. And I really hope all the negotiators take it to the table in COP26 next year. I would like to thank our esteemed panelists for this amazing discussion, really insightful, and I hope that all of you have enjoyed it. Thank you very much, and back to you, Aisha.
Thank you very much, Noura, and thanks to all the panelists in the first panel. Now, let's move to the second panel for today, which is focused on the blue carbon economy. This panel will be moderated by Professor Miranda Schroer, a Task Force 2 co-chair and a professor of environment and climate policy in the School of Governance, Technical University of Munich. Professor Miranda research focuses on the governance of climate change, low carbon energy transitions, and sustainable development in Germany and the European Union, the United States, and East Asia. Professor Schroer is Vice Chair of the European Environment and Sustainable Development Advisory Council, International Director of the Board of the Institute of Global Environmental Strategies in Japan, a member of the advisory board of the Swiss National Foundation's research program 71 on the Swiss energy transition, and co-chair of the National Committee to monitor the nuclear waste management site location search in Germany. She has served on numerous governmental advisory bodies in Asia, including the China Council for the Environment and Development and Europe, advising on energy transition, climate governance, and sustainable development. Professor Miranda has published widely on environment and energy matters, including for policymakers and for more general audiences. In addition, she is a member of the Advisory Council for the Sustainable Development of Catalonia. With that, I would like to give you, Professor Miranda, the mic to start the discussion. Thank you very much.
Yes, thank you very much, Aisha. It's a real pleasure to be here. I really appreciated the last panel, and I think we can look forward to another very exciting panel here. So today's panel is going to focus on the blue carbon economy. And as we all know, the oceans are incredibly important, both in terms of what they provide us in terms of biodiversity, but also as a very important carbon sink. And today we will hear some different perspectives on what can be done to protect the oceans and contribute to dealing both with climate protection and biodiversity loss. We have three really distinguished speakers with us today. The first that I'd like to briefly introduce, Professor Carlos Duarte, who is the Tariq Ahmed Jufali Research Chair, where he holds it, in the Red Sea Ecology at the King Abdullah University of Science and Technology, of course, in Saudi Arabia. He's also holding an adjunct position at the Arctic Research Center in Aarhus University in Denmark. His research deals with global change in marine ecosystems, marine-based solutions to global challenges, including climate change, and evidence-based strategies to rebuild the abundance of marine life by 2050. If you look at his list of research activities, it's really very, very impressive. I was particularly impressed that he led the Malaspina 2010 expedition that sailed the world's oceans to examine the impact of global change on ocean ecosystems and to explore their biodiversity. And he has been ranked as the top marine biologist in the world. Very impressive indeed. President of the American Society of Luminology and Oceanography from 2007 to 2010, and with a very impressive list of honors, just 2 or 3 of which I'll name here. The Carlo Hype Award for Excellence in Marine Biodiversity Research, the Ramon Margalef Ecology Award, and the BBVA Foundation Frontiers of Knowledge Award in Ecology and Conservation Biology. Our second speaker is Ralph Shami, Assistant Director in the Institute for Capacity Development in the International Monetary Fund, who has overseen the development and implementation of the internal economics training program for all IMF economists. That's quite influential. Revamping of the Institute's external training program for officials from member countries has also been part of his activity list. And he was previously Assistant Director and Division Chief in the Middle East and Central Asian Department, and recipient of the 2004 IMF Operational Excellence Award for his work on fragile states. So a very important focus on the Middle East and North African, Central Asian regions, which of course is very critical for this issue area as well. And our third and last speaker, Dr. Rachel Meidel, Fellow in Energy and Environment at Rice University's Baker Institute for Public Policy, whose research focuses on plastic sustainability, domestic and international policy and law as it relates to imports and exports and life cycle management of hazardous wastes, and also deals with safety and environmental regulations of the treatment, storage, disposal, and transportation of chemicals, both within and outside of the US. She has previously been appointed as Deputy Associate Administrator at the Pipeline and Hazardous Materials Safety Administration in Washington, DC. She led the agency's domestic and international strategy, policy, and programs on hazardous materials. And she too has quite an impressive list of other activities and awards. But I would like to keep the focus here on what we're going to learn about in terms of the blue carbon economy. So I would like to begin now, turning with my first questions to Carlos Duarte. And the rule of the game is each one of you will have 5 minutes per question, and I'll ask each one of you one question and then come back to you for a second round of questions. So, Carlos, could I ask you to help all of us listening in on what you see as nature-based solutions to climate change?
Thank you, Miranda, and thank you to the organizers for the invitation to join you today. And I would like to reflect on linking back to the previous session on circular carbon economy and actually how nature works. So the reason why the circular carbon economy makes sense is that this is actually how nature manages carbon. So nature manages carbon through a close balance between emissions and removals of carbon dioxide through photosynthesis and respiration. And this is a very tight balance that moves every year around 600 gigaton of carbon dioxide from the atmosphere into the biosphere, and then returns back that amount of carbon dioxide to the atmosphere. And the offset between these two very large values is so small that we cannot really measure it, but we calculate that it's about 0.2% might be the offset. So a very close balance. But this close balance has been impacted by human activities. Before we started to emit large amounts of carbon through ecosystem degradation and burning of fossil fuels, we actually had done already something to the ocean that we're still trying to recover from. What humans did to the ocean is that we hunted and chased whales all around the ocean in the 1700s. Not for their meat, not for their flesh, but to use their oil to light the streets of North America and Europe. So in fact, whales were our first energy source coming into the Industrial Revolution. And the reason why we have depleted whale stocks, and my colleague in the panel will probably elaborate more on this today, is that we actually burned them. So we have depleted not only whales, but during the Industrial Revolution and later on, then we also depleted marine ecosystems and ecosystems on land. So we have actually removed a lot of carbon that used to be part of the biosphere and now is in the atmosphere. So nature-based solutions for climate change mitigation, on a nutshell, can be defined as an approach to decarbonize the atmosphere, to recarbonize the biosphere. So it's about rebuilding the abundance of life on oceans and land, and also the capacity of these ecosystems to store safely carbon.
Can I ask you a follow-up question related to that? What are we talking about in terms of absorption capacity? To what extent can biodiversity in whales here play a role?
Yeah, so I would probably defer the specific question of whales to the next speaker, because he has actually done some cutting-edge work on precisely the role of whales, but I will focus on other ecosystems. So for instance, on land and ocean forests, and on ocean mangrove forests and seagrass meadows and salt marshes are able to remove more carbon dioxide from the atmosphere that they return through respiration and the function of the ecosystem. And that carbon is stored in the biomass and the soils, and it can be stored for long times. So already in the 90s, there was the concept emerging that conservation of tropical forests that were under threat to be converted into grasslands and other ecosystems was an effective approach to avoid emissions and therefore mitigate climate change. And that became an important element of strategies. But then during the 1990s, we discovered that marine ecosystems and coastal habitats have a unique capacity to act as very intense carbon sinks. And then we refer to this capacity and the management of this capacity as blue carbon strategies. So that names the session today. So blue carbon strategies refer to the capacity of these coastal ecosystems to sequester carbon safely in the sediments for millennia. A key difference between terrestrial ecosystems and mangrove, seagrass meadows, and salt marshes is that whereas the carbon in forests on land can be returned to the atmosphere during forest fires, and sadly we have seen a wave of forest fires this year in Australia, then in the Amazonia, and now in California, then in the ocean we have no fires. So the carbon that is stored in the soils in the ocean is actually safe for millennia. And in fact, much of that actually we're using today in the forms of oil that was produced millions of years ago. So carbon in the ocean, this blue carbon is stored in a very safe manner. So now we are developing approaches to conserve and restore these habitats to contribute to climate change mitigation while delivering a lot of value also to society through other benefits that these ecosystems provide.
Thanks. Terrific start to our conversation here. Ralph Shami, you were spoken to here with this question about whales. So I'm going to go directly to this question and ask you what you see as the value of whales in terms of carbon sequestration, climate mitigation, and perhaps you can also say something about what are we talking about here? What kind of scale of importance is this?
Thank you very much, Miranda. Thank you, Noura, for the invitation. It's wonderful to be on this panel. Let me cut to the chase. I think what we're really talking about here are nature-based solutions to climate change, of which whales play a role. I did not discover that. The scientists already had discovered that. What I realized I could do is translate the beautiful science that Carlos and others have actually developed into the sphere of public policy. I've been at the IMF for 22 years. I've dealt with governments, presidents, all kinds of people in the public policy sphere, and they speak a language that that scientists do not speak. So what I did, my background is in sciences. My first degree actually is in sciences. And so I was privy to the discussions among marine biologists about what the whales do. Turns out that the whales capture on their body, on average, 9 tons of carbon. So that's times 11/3. That gives you 33 tons of carbon dioxide kept out of the atmosphere on an average whale. Okay, now if it's a blue whale, it's a lot bigger than that number. And when they die, whales sink to the bottom of the ocean because they have negative buoyancy. And it takes a very long time for the whale to disintegrate at the bottom of the ocean. So basically what they're doing, they're capturing the carbon on their body. We all have carbon, we're all carbon units, but they have it in spades. And then when they die, they sink to the bottom of the ocean and that carbon is sequestered. That's the first part of the puzzle. The second very important part of this puzzle is that whales, and I'm talking about the great whales, okay? The blue whales, fin whales, sperm whales, and so forth. They are called baleen whales because they don't have teeth and they feed on something very, very small called krill. Now, they feed on krill. Krill eats directly or indirectly phytoplankton. Now, why am I bringing that up? Because you started the conversation by saying the ocean is the carbon sink. In fact, the phytoplankton captures about 37 gigatons of carbon dioxide per annum. Okay, phytoplankton, this microscopic organism that floats, okay, captures 37 gigatons of carbon dioxide per annum. That's equivalent to 4 Amazon forests per year. So they are really the lungs of the planet, among other, as Carlos is saying, the mangroves and the seagrass and salt marshes. They are the lungs of the planet, is in the ocean. After all, we have to remind everybody that every now and then it's good to remind them that 4/5 of the planet is water, and we are land-based mammals, so we live on 1/5 of the planet. Anyway, back to the phytoplankton. So the whales eat krill. The krill feed on phytoplankton. Now let's close the loop. The phytoplankton, to survive, it needs nitrogen, it needs phosphorus, and it needs iron. And I haven't had my breakfast yet because it's 7 a.m. here. And why am I saying this? Because the phytoplankton finds that nutrition in the poop, in the fecal plumes of the whales. So imagine this beautiful circle of life. The whales eat krill, the krill eats phyto, and the phyto, in order to produce and grow, they need these 3 elements, and they find them in the poop of the whale. So the whale, in a sense, is a very smart creature that fertilizes its own food. It fertilizes phyto, and when there's more phyto, there's more krill, there's more krill, there's more food for the whales. And of course, a lot of other organisms also live off of the krill. So why is that important? Because then what I did is, with my colleagues, I looked at how much is the increase in the productivity of phyto coming from the activity of the whales. Once you put that together, what the whales capture on their body directly, which is 33 tons of carbon dioxide, by the way, that's equivalent to 1,500 trees, okay? That's just the whale itself. But indirectly, through its impact on the productivity, primary production, you're talking about one whale is equivalent to thousands of trees in terms of its impact and on the capture and the sequestration of carbon dioxide from the air. So when you talk about nature-based solutions, okay, Carlos already mentioned you have mangroves, you have seagrass, you have salt marsh, you have kelp forests, and they capture tremendous amounts of carbon from the air. The whales is another example of this creature that has been roaming the seas for millions of years, quietly doing the cleaning for us, while we were, as Carlos put it, been hunting them almost to extinction. So when I was listening to the previous panel and Dr. Paul was talking about, sort of offsetting of the carbon, I'm thinking about offsetting of the carbon emission by investing in nature-based solutions. Why? Because they're there, rather than creating new technologies that we don't know the externalities, we don't know what could be the side effects of. Here, what you have is from Carlos's work and others, is nature-based solutions in front of our eyes, and all we're saying is, let them live. Let nature recuperate, because it's a natural carbon sink when it's vibrant and when it's alive. And I can expand on this based on what you asked me next.
Thanks very, very much. I'm going to leave it at that for just a minute. We'll get back to you. But what you've said here about the importance of essentially protecting the ecological systems and the biodiversity of the oceans has a lot more to do with climate change than most people realize, that these are integrated systems. And to keep this conversation going, but to bring in another element that really needs to be addressed here, Rachel Meidel, I'd like to bring in this question about what we hear about in the media. We hear actually much more about plastics in the ocean than we hear about the importance of protecting the whale population or ecological systems related to climate change. So I'd like to ask you why the plastic problem is so important. But second, also, why is it getting so much more attention? And how can we also link this perhaps to a better understanding of what we need for climate, for ocean protection, blue carbon economy protection?
All right, well, thank you, Miranda, for the introduction, and Noura for the invite to speak here this morning with the rest of the esteemed panelists and others here. And the problem of plastics is important because we see it littered throughout our ecosystems globally. And the rate that we are producing plastics, 400 million tons of plastic every year, and knowing that around 8 million tons enters the oceans annually, this is significant. And the issue with this is that we just don't have a full understanding of the extent of the impacts of marine plastic pollution on the environment and on the biodiversity. And tracking inputs of plastic waste and understanding their fate and distribution is extremely difficult. So it's very challenging to even know what the actual volumes are and what the impacts of plastic waste is in our oceans. We can look at some of the current and projected numbers as guidance. I mean, we know that we have generated 8.3 billion metric tons of virgin plastic since the 1950s, and 6.3 billion metric tons of waste has been generated from that. And only 9% has been recycled. Most of it is accumulated in landfills or abandoned in the environment. And so it's extensive. And what we do know is that microplastics, they are present in aquatic ecosystems. And there's a lot of evidence of this in drinking water and food sources. And we've seen plastic pollution and the results it has with ingestion and entanglement. And we know that it has the potential to influence the feeding, growth, and reproduction and survival of biota. But in general, there's just a dearth of data on concentrations and effects in the ecosystem. And so we know that there's some knowledge on the ocean surface, but there's just almost no data for freshwater systems and air and soil compartments. We don't really know hardly anything below the ocean surface and deep sea sediments. And so, without this understanding of its fate and exposure and its transport and food web transfer and stressors, interactions with other stressors like chemical eutrophication and acidification, it's hard for us to really understand what those impacts are for biodiversity. Now, I know that there in the media and in scientific journals, there are many, many documented cases, but there's just no scientific consensus on the full extent of the impacts on biodiversity. There's no global consensus around this on if the presence of plastics translates to effects. So there's a lot of opportunity here to better understand that. And then, lastly, what I want to say, about this is that we have current limitations in standardized sampling and measuring microplastics and plastics, and then also reporting on these methodologies. They are drastically preventing progress in our understanding of the true effects of microplastics and for that matter, nanoplastics in the environment and on biodiversity. And so this lack of standardization results in a very fragmented and incomparable and misguided results. And you know, when we don't have the standardization and harmonization in sampling and measuring and reporting, it's very difficult to conduct studies and draw valid, reproducible comparisons because there's just no globally standardized approach. And so there's a lot of work to be done here, a lot of opportunity. But the problem of plastics in our marine environments and throughout the ecosystems is pretty extensive, but we just don't understand and know a lot about, you know, if you know, these impacts or the presence in the environment, whether they translate to deleterious impacts.
So it seems to me that one thing you're saying here is there's need for a whole lot more research, but do we have time for more research? Before I let you answer that question, I'm actually going to go back and ask each one of you to think a little bit about what are the big recommendations for the G20. And the reason for asking this is because the T20 process is really meant to try to bring the science into thinking about policy options and trying to also raise awareness about issues. So I can already answer the question I asked you and said, of course we need more science, but maybe you can tell us a little bit more when I get back to you on that. I'd like to go back to Carlos Duarte right now and ask you, Carlos, what do you think are the most important things for the G20 to take away from the research that you've done in your task force group? You've produced a really terrific report together on the blue economy, the blue carbon economy. What are the takeaway messages? Carlos, we need your microphone.
In this report, I was honored to contribute to, led actually by our chair today, Dr. Noura. We produced a number of recommendations for the G20 to play a more active role in the blue carbon economy. So the first proposal was to create a technical working group on the blue carbon economy, and that will link ecosystem-based adaptation and nature-based solutions from a marine perspective. So we believe that it will be important for the G20 also being custodian of a large fraction of the mangrove, seagrass, meadows, and an ocean area that is managed of the world to take a role, to take a stand on this area. And we also had a proposal to examine what are the enablers at the regional and global scales of actions in terms of the blue carbon economy, through marine protected areas and also through the deployment of nature-based solutions to have this maximize their capacity to contribute to climate change mitigation and adaptation. We also have a recommendation on enhancing research efforts because the family of options of blue carbon strategies to achieve climate change mitigation and adaptation keeps growing every month, and we just heard about the important role that whales may play, but we are also carefully looking at the role of seaweed aquaculture as a scalable solution, and also we're looking at management of sediments beyond these coastal habitats also as a possible solution. So the family of options keep growing, and we need to continue our research efforts to document this. And one boundary condition also is that developing these blue carbon solutions is not only a component of climate change mitigation and adaptation, but it's also an essential component of our efforts towards achieving UN Sustainable Development Goals, particularly to achieve a vibrant ocean ecosystem. And this year I led a paper that was published in Nature called Rebuilding Marine Life that received a lot of attention, where we reviewed scientific evidence, including our capacity to rebuild these coastal habitats, and we provide examples of the successes we've had also in rebuilding stocks of whales. And we pledged that we could rebuild the abundance of life in the oceans by 2050. And we actually put a price tag on that effort. And also what would be the return on investment. So about 10 times return on investment of every dollar that we will contribute to this effort. And again, I believe that this is in fact an investment case that the G20 should look carefully and will deliver many benefits, including benefits for our climate system as well.
You know, everything you say, it makes so much sense. The oceans are a source of food. The oceans are a source of climate protection. The oceans are a source of leisure. And that should be at a very, very high level on the priority list. That makes a lot of sense. And the nature-based solutions to climate change might actually be something that people can really relate to, because people do care about nature. Ralph, Chami, I'd like to ask you, how do we go forward with valuing nature-based solutions to climate change? You've worked at the IMF, you've worked with governments. How is it that we convince people, how do we convince policymakers of this, you know, the importance of this? Carlos mentioned that there's an economic benefit here, but how do we really move governments here? How can we help them think about what to do?
So the cost of mitigation was always understood very well. So when you talk to a policy person or somebody with money or the person in charge of budgets, they understand the cost of mitigation. You say, we want to protect marine environment. They say, oh, how much is that going to cost me? Right away. That's the first question. But the other side of the equation was missing. So you'll say, well, it's going to cost us so many dollars to protect. They say, what do I get in return? And here is what I discovered was the sort of the asynchronicity of the conversation, because the scientists would start saying, well, you get biodiversity, you get, and suddenly the policymaker is, you know, looking all over, you know, trying to, you know, just basically not say, okay, this conversation is over. Because what they're really looking for is a dollar amount. When the scientists are like the economists, I'm a theoretical economist by training, okay, we also live in the world of mathematics and high level algebra, and you know, we understand it ourselves, but no one outside of our very, very small group understands it. So we become irrelevant to the conversation. So that's what was happening when I was observing. That's how I came into this work on the whales, because I was observing how the scientists were talking about it. They talk about, you know, because that's their work, they're specialists, so looking at, you know, tissue samples and this and that and biodiversity. And where the policymaker is asking is how much, what is the benefit? Can you tell me the benefits in dollars? Why? Because the policymaker or the person with the purse is going to do cost benefit analysis. We all do that in our daily lives. What is the cost and what is the benefit? So what I realized I could do, because I'm a financial economist with some background in science, is I can take the science and translate it into dollars and cents. So what was missing was the benefit side. The benefit side resided in the world of science. So what I did in the case of the whales, for example, I took, what does the whale do? Well, it captures carbon. Well, how much carbon? So much carbon. What's the price of carbon? Well, we have an exchange market for carbon. So I took a price from the exchange market. At the time it was $23. And we know that the price should be much, much higher than that. But let's stay with 23. And I said, okay, I used to also be a professor of finance. So when I taught my students how to invest, I would say, here's a bond, and a bond pays you so much, you know, in terms of returns over the lifetime of a bond. So think of the whale for now as an asset. An asset gives you value over its lifetime. Okay? So when it dies, it sinks to the bottom of the ocean, and it sequesters 33 tons of carbon dioxide. Guess what? That's in the language of finance, it's a balloon payment. You take the present value of it. But then the whale is capturing carbon indirectly through the phytoplankton on a yearly basis. Well, that's a bond that's giving you payments on a yearly basis for the lifetime of the bond. So you take those payments and you discount them to the present. And guess what? The value of a whale as a minimum is $2 million. Now, why is that important? Not because I want to wow you with a number. By the way, I could have beefed up that number to be a lot more than that. It's because I wanted to show you that right now, when you kill a whale and you feed it in some countries where they still eat whale meat, the price of a whale, of a dead whale, is $40,000. $40,000 price. Maybe if it's a fin whale, it's a bit bigger. Maybe it's about 80, fetches about $80,000. Whereas a living whale is worth $2 million. Now, why is that important? The number itself is because we are talking about building a blue economy. When you want to start talking serious and you want the policymakers to take us seriously, you have to speak their language. We cannot stay in the world of science, okay? We have to say, what is an economy we're thinking of? So you start with the science. You definitely need the science. Yeah, you need Carlos's science, okay? But then you have to translate that science through the valuation. Once you have the valuation, you need the policy framework, meaning you need the governments to come in and basically say, okay, if you kill a whale, I'm just using the whale as an example. Okay, the whale is a being. By the way, in New Zealand, they've confirmed personhood on rivers. They've called, now animals in New Zealand are sentient beings as of 3-4 months ago, meaning they have rights, and you have obligations towards them. You start with that, and then you put the penalty. But what is the penalty? Penalty for a whale is 2 million. So now what happens is the market starts to take you seriously, because the market say, oh, wait a minute, that asset now, that natural asset has rights and obligations, and it has value. So the markets, because you need to bring in, the panel before us was talking about bringing in investments. You need to bring in investments into this. That's how the private sector comes in, because they come in when they realize there's money to be made. So now you bring in the private sector, you have the public, you have the regulatory framework. The local communities are incredibly important, because they're the ones who will ensure, the sustainability of the effort. And when the local communities realize that there's sustainability in this, there is income coming in, then basically you have the local communities who find employment, sustenance from it, you have the private investors, you have the governments, you have the CSOs coming in, showing you the know-how, and you have organizations such as the IFIs who can, sort of write off the residual risk for let's say in developing countries where things could be a bit risky. So in a nutshell, this is how you build a blue economy. And by the way, only then economic growth would be sustainable, would be inclusive, and would be nature friendly. Otherwise, all other discussions are just, I would say, belong to the old 21st century, pre-COVID. Thank you.
Thank you very much. You've done a terrific job of showing us also the importance of being able to communicate science to policymakers. And one way of doing that is certainly to bring in an economic perspective. Although what you also said that I thought was interesting was bringing in a traditional perspective on the importance of nature as a being of its own. So Rachel, I'm going to give you more or less the last word here, because we're wrapping up in terms of time. Rachel, can you tell us your take on the role of science, the G20, and where we go forward with dealing with plastics? And also your microphone, please.
Sure, thanks for that reminder, Miranda. Yeah, I mean, so with with science, we can't we can't not include science in these discussions, but as many of us know, a lot of that research takes time to come to fruition. But because this is such a multifaceted issue, and it ranges, solutions and policy interventions range across the entire supply chain, there's a lot of work that can be done concurrently. And so, I mean, one of the recommendations would be for the G20 member countries, in collaboration with the private sector, to provide institutional support to support business models and eco-innovations around this circular supply chain. And I'd be remiss without mentioning that a critical piece of this that we oftentimes forget is that that we have to advocate for the integration of the informal sector within the formal sector in the waste management domain. And not considering this sector can absolutely affect the economics of the waste system. We have years and years of experience and data that illustrate that it can be very counterproductive to establish new formalized waste systems without integrating this already existing formal system. And we have emerging markets out there, and they lack a lot of the capabilities that that some of these formal structures have. But there are approximately 11 million people in the informal sector, and so we have to figure out a way to integrate them into the solutions and find a way for them to generate social and economic benefits to the local communities. And so if we look at some of the data, we know that the informal sector collected and prevented 27 million metric tons of plastic waste from ending up in landfills in the ocean in 2016. And so that means that more than half of all the plastic material collected for recycling globally was carried out by the informal sector. So when we think about solutions, we have to learn about what that means for this. And so the other piece that I think is critical for the G20 to consider is mainstreaming the integration of life cycle assessment for evaluating the impact of plastics in any of the alternatives, whether they're bio-based alternatives or others, into solutions. We have to look at chartering pathways for the adoption of these life cycle strategies. These metrics are going to help us determine if the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change performance indicators and the UN Sustainable Development Goals are being achieved. Right now, the current life cycle assessments that we're using are not standardized, and they don't account for social impacts. They do not account for the full range of environmental impacts, and they do not consider economic impacts. These are all conducted outside of the assessments that are typically used now. And so when we talk about sustainability, and that's been the underpinning of this discussion, is that we really don't understand the true cost of transitioning to circularity without sustainability, without understanding the economic impact, the environmental and the social costs. So in this context, the work with the Life Cycle Initiative, which is a public-private multi-stakeholder partnership that's hosted by the UN Environment Program, they can provide a global consensus on life cycle impact assessment indicators and encourage countries to standardize the use of these assessments. I'd also like to mention that plastic waste, or certain types of plastic waste, are now managed under the Basel Convention on the Control of the Transboundary Movement of Hazardous Waste and their disposal. And G20 countries should commit to engaging with the Plastic Waste Partnership. And that is established under the convention to mobilize businesses and governments and academic and civil societies to improve and promote the environmentally sound management of plastic waste at the global level. And then lastly, a recommendation from our paper is to standardize the methods for sampling, analyzing, and reporting on microplastics in the environment. To standardize the exposure modeling for the accuracy of assessing the hazards, and for also standardizing the risk assessments for evaluating and understanding the interaction of plastics with other stressors in the environment. And all of this is going to ensure that there is some type of consistency out there and reproducibility of these studies. And this is something that we are currently lacking. And so there's a couple of different avenues to do this. They can engage with the Joint Group of Experts on Scientific Aspects of Marine Protection, GESAMP, and this is the working group 40. And they oversee the issues relating to sources, fate, and effects of plastics on the marine environment. There's also the Science Advice for Policy by European academies. They conducted a scientific evidence review report on microplastics. And so the G20 National Academies of Sciences should utilize the findings from this scientific perspective and provide a neutral and global platform for international initiatives and standards development cooperation. And this would evaluate and unify the work on microplastic standard setting organizations such as ASTM International, the American National Standards Institute, NSF International, and ISO, and along with all the work that other trade associations, academia, and other relevant entities out there are working on. And so these are our top high-level recommendations that precipitated from our paper.
Thanks so much. What a terrific panel. I was listening to all of this and thinking, oh, I have to get you all to come and talk to my class. And we should get the G20 and the T20 to make these recordings available to a larger public. You've really been a terrific panel here, very, very informative. We've learned a lot about nature-based solutions for the blue carbon economy, and also about plastic management and the need for a whole lot more research and standardization. So I thank you all very, very much, and I turn the floor back over to Aisha, I guess. Is it Aisha?
Yes. Well, thank you very much, Professor Miranda, and thanks also for the panelists for the great insights on the blue carbon economy.
Thank you.
Now, we are moving to the third panel for today. It is on climate action and post-COVID-19 economic recovery. I will be the moderator for this panel. And this panel will focus on two main questions. One is where the G20 nation stands today in terms of their climate action. And second, whether the COVID-19 has fostered or delayed the G20 efforts in terms of their efforts to factor sustainability and climate action in their post-COVID-19 recovery plans. That is in light of the G20 representing almost 90% of global GDP and around 2/3 of the world population, as well as accounting for nearly 80% of global greenhouse gas emissions. With this in mind, if the G20 only have advanced their climate action as well as their energy transition efforts, we could expect a dramatic decline in the global greenhouse gas emissions, as well as expecting that we will not miss the goal of meeting limiting the global warming to below 1.5 degrees Celsius. Also, with this in mind, despite the social and economic hardship that has been brought by the COVID-19, as the world leading group, G20 nations can play a significant role in ensuring that we build back better, and by ensuring that sustainable and climate resilient are factored in their post-economic recovery plans. Okay, so I hope you can hear me well now. Okay, thank you, Noura. So to discuss this and more, I am delighted to be joined today by distinguished scholars. First, we have Dr. Marie Lume with us. Dr. Marie is a policy-oriented social scientist with 15 years of experience with think tanks, academia, and consulting. She works on climate change and sustainable energy with a focus on the Gulf Arab states. In her other areas of expertise, she focuses on global climate governance and has a decade of hands-on experience, having participated in the UN climate change negotiations in various capacities. She worked for leading energy and sustainable development and foreign research institutions, including the Oxford Institute for Energy Studies, International Institute for Sustainable Development at Georgetown University, and Finnish Institute of International Affairs. Dr. Marie Lume most recently led a research program at the Emitters Diplomatic Academy on energy, climate change, and sustainable development. Dr. Marie holds a PhD from Durham University and MSc International Politics from the University of Helsinki. Second, we have Professor Jonathan Stern, who is a distinguished research fellow and a founder of Natural Gas Research Program at the Oxford Institute of Energy Studies. Professor Jonathan Stern has worked on natural gas issues as an academic and consultant for 40 years. He holds professorship at the University of Dundee and Imperial College London, and is the author and editor of several books, including Natural Gas in Asia, The Pricing of Internationally Traded Gas, The Future of Gas in the Gulf, as well as author of 2 chapters in LNG Markets in Transition, The Great Reconfiguration. His most recent publications are Narratives for Gas in Decarbonizing European Energy Markets and Challenges to the Future of LNG Decarbonization, Affordability, and Profitability. He is currently working on the study of methane emissions in natural gas and LNG value chains to be published later in 2020. Third, we have Dr. Leila Dagher, who is an associate professor of economics at the American University of Beirut. Dr. Leila previously served as a director of the Institute of Financial Economics, chaired the Department of Economics at the same university, and has been an adjunct lecturer at the George Washington University since 2016. Dr. Dagher's research is at the nexus of energy, environment, and economics. Using econometric tools, she studied various aspects of the environmental and energy sectors. Her research is frequently presented at international conferences and has appeared in the Energy Journal, Energy Policy, Energy Economics, and other leading peer-reviewed journals. Dr. Dagher has been a visiting scholar at Harvard's Kennedy School of Government, George Washington University, Virginia Tech, UCLA, and the National Renewable Energy Lab in Golden, Colorado. She holds a Bachelor of Engineering from the American University of Beirut and a PhD in Mineral Economics from the Colorado School of Mines. With that, I would like to kick off the discussion of this panel by starting with Dr. Marie Lume. So before we start, I would like to acknowledge that all the speakers have published policy briefs for the Task Force 2 on Climate Change and Environment, and today we will discuss more about those policy briefs. So Dr. Marie, in your policy brief, you pointed out in the importance of putting the green energy transition at the heart of the COVID-19 recovery plans. My question to you, why do you think that G20 countries should be concerned on factoring or putting the green energy transition at the heart of their COVID-19 recovery measures? And if you could tell us also like how they could do that. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Aisha, for those questions and the kind introduction. It's a great pleasure to be in this distinguished company. Indeed, we wrote a paper that I'll be talking about shortly, but I think just to take a step back to start with your question, why, I do feel like I'm preaching to a large extent to the converted, but there's a few observations I'd like to make on why I feel it's important to put climate action and the green energy transition at the heart of the COVID recovery. Now, first of all, there's a lot of rhetoric around this being an opportunity. I think it's important to reframe this not as an opportunity, but as a last chance. This is not something optional. This is something that has to be done. As you, Aisha, mentioned, the G20 countries account for almost 80% of global emissions, so they're key stakeholders in this. They absolutely need to prevent brown recoveries, and recoveries have to be simultaneous or synonymous with green recoveries. So that's the starting point. But there's other reasons also why. As we know, COVID has shown that change is possible. It's about political will. It's about saying we have to do this. However, with climate change, the challenge is still that the mindset of something immediate that needs to be done is not yet there. The science is not new. The first climate change conference, the first World Climate Change Conference, took place in 79, and it highlighted already the role of fossil fuels in climate change and the need for international cooperation. The precautionary principle was enshrined in the UN Climate Convention in 92. Incrementalism is what has taken us here, and it hasn't worked. We're now at 1.1 degrees of global warming, and we're headed to 3 degrees or more. And the impacts are getting worse. The past decade was the hottest on record. We heard reports last week that the wildfires, the smoke from the wildfires from the US West Coast had reached Europe, and there are flooding all around Asia. And August this year, was the hottest month on record historically. The window for action is closing fast, as we know. If we want to stay below 1.5, emissions over the next decade need to be halved, and for below 2, we need to cut them by a fourth. The UN system, of course, is there, and climate change is a priority there, but progress there has been too slow, and the system dynamic has its challenges. The Paris Agreement, just to give an example, does not mention energy in a substantive article. G20, however, has demonstrated a lot more agility in this regard and action orientation. So this brings me to the opportunities. There's obviously two big opportunities. One is the fact there are massive flows of finance that will be going in the form of investments in recovery. And the other one is that many sectors are already forced to rethink themselves, like aviation and mobility. So in our view, it's not really about COVID being something qualitatively necessarily different. It has bought us some time. There's no need to reinvent the wheel. However, the tools are there. What needs to happen is ramping up action and ambition. That's as simple as that. And action simply costs less than inaction. As our starting point in the paper, what we did is we combined the expertise of our large team of 15 authors to focus in on the power sector. And this is because, according to IRENA, the power sector could deliver 70% of the needed CO2 reductions through mid-century. This will require ramping up of renewable production. This will require decommissioning of fossil fuel production and a revolution in electrification, of course. It would lead to job losses, but it will create many more. So again, action will cost a lot less than inaction. Now for the second part of your question, and I'll be succinct. There are three categories in which we think G20 countries can do something about the energy transition. What we did specifically, however, given that this is a massive task, even for the power sector, we zoomed in on the private sector. The private sector is being incredibly hard hit by the crisis, but it has immense potential for innovation and potential as a source for climate financing, and also in job creation, of course. So to play with the quote by the US President Clinton, the era of the big government is now back. So what we asked was, what can the government do to support the private sector specifically to accelerate this transition? So the first of these three areas is what we call grow the green. Ideally, all new power generating capacity should be renewable or clean. But as we know, countries still continue to spend, even this year, in fossil fuel power capacity. What we're recommending is facilitating financing for clean energy infrastructure. That's a no-brainer. At the time of crisis, this could come in form of easing credit guarantees for renewable energy developers. And there could also be experimentation around a so-called spillover tax revenue scheme, which distributes tax revenue to infrastructure operators and from the positive spillovers that infrastructure brings to the region. There's more on that in the paper. We also outline different ways to promote flexible, transparent methods to procure new renewable energy capacity. These include corporate purchasing and auctions. Now the second part, so the first being growing the green, the second one is transitioning the brown. Of course, we need to make sure that we leave no one behind, but also we need to make sure that the bailouts and the stimulus packages come with strict environmental conditionalities. The airlines are a very good example in my mind of an industry that is on life support, where arguably some of the revenue would be much better spent in stimulating green growth or in retraining of the workforce. What we recommend is harmonizing and mandating climate-related disclosures for large corporations across the G20 that are major electricity producers and consumers. The G20 has already done a lot of good work on this, so harmonization is where we think it could contribute. Countries need to accelerate, obviously, their fossil fuel subsidy reforms, and now is a good time with the low oil prices. They should also consider now seriously implementing carbon pricing arrangements if they haven't yet. Some regions and countries are debating carbon border adjustments, so now would be a good time to start an international dialogue on this. And of course, early fossil fuel power capacity retirements are crucial, a crucial part of the mix in a below 2-degree scenario. Finally, to transition the brown, we're suggesting that the G20 countries consider green transition assistance for these incumbent sectors. and their workers. And what the G20 could focus specifically on is principles of this assistance, which could include conditionality on decarbonization for the aid, and a focus on funding only decarbonization and not windfall. The third area is transforming the rest. So we had grow the green, transition the brown, and transform the rest. And with this, we refer to the endless opportunities on the demand side to encourage energy efficiency and speed up electrification. This can create obviously lots of jobs. Building retrofits, public transport, EV infrastructure are just some examples. In the paper, we outline best practices from the areas of zero energy communities, tackling barriers to flexible demand response options such as smart meters or distributed energy storage. Life cycle cost performance disclosure for all components of the built environment. So an example here are home energy scores that are tested in some parts of the US. And finally, accelerating the electrification of transport, which is crucial, including through building infrastructure, but also mandating major vehicle manufacturers to accelerate the deployment of EVs. And so to sum up, the governments can do a lot. And so we've identified these three areas. If there's time in the second round of questions, I'd like to talk about the role of the G20 as an institution. It has a crucial role to play here in coordinating these approaches and ramping up ambition. So I'll stop.
Thank you very much, Marie. I will come back to you with that question if we have more time. Thank you very much for highlighting on the role and the important role of the private sector in advancing the energy transition. Now, I would like to move to Professor Jonathan Stern. Are you with us?
I am with you.
Great. So I looked at your policy brief, and in there, you pointed out that the G20 countries account for 60 to 90% of the global production and consumption of fossil fuels. You also pointed out to the importance of advancing the framework used for measurement, reporting, verification, and certification of methane emissions from fossil fuel production and natural gas value chain. I think this is important, especially if we imagine a future, an energy market future dominated by natural gas. And we know that the natural gas is not a greenhouse gas emission free. It is highly associated with methane emissions, which are more powerful greenhouse gases than the carbon dioxide. I would like you, please, if you could tell us how could the G20 nations ensure that fuel switching, by, for example, switching from other fossil fuels to natural gas, is not jeopardizing global commitment to cut greenhouse gas emissions, especially the methane emissions, using the framework that you are proposing in the policy brief. Thank you very much.
Aisha, thank you very much indeed. I wonder if you could bring up my slides. If they're up, I don't see them. Thank you very much. And if you could move to the next slide, please. So as you said, methane is a much more powerful gas than CO2, and it's been increasing much more rapidly than CO2 during the 2010s. And because the G20 countries account for such a large proportion of global fossil fuel production, this becomes a major difficulty. And we have put together 6 recommendations. Could you go to the next slide, please? The first recommendation is that we need to collect the data for methane emissions from all fossil fuels. Venting and flaring, particularly from oil and gas production, is really, we think, the biggest source of methane emissions. Followed possibly, I say possibly because of the data problems, by emissions from natural gas transmission and distribution, and probably also storage operations, where we have reasonable data. What we do not have good data on is any emissions from coal mines. So the key question that this whole effort is based on is empirical measurement of methane emissions, not as we have at present, measurement by use of standard emission factors. The key rationale for this proposal are to really decide and therefore feed into government calculations of their emissions reduction, what their emissions are, and therefore how they can be reduced. And then, and here's where we get to your question, whether switching from coal and oil to gas does in fact produce positive greenhouse gas results. Can I have the next slide, please? So what we have to do, and what we hope the G20 governments should agree, is to establish approved methodologies. Now, this is very complicated because at the moment we have so-called bottom-up methodologies, in other words, ground level measurements. These are now being supplemented by top-down or aerial and increasingly satellite measurements. Now, there's a great deal of debate in the literature as to which of these measurements is more accurate. And there are very important arguments on either side for and against top-down and bottom-up. But what we need is a reconciliation of these methodologies so that we get for each source of methane, particularly in the production sector, an agreement as to what the actual methane measurements are. Initially, what we have to do is to identify and eliminate what's called super emitters. In other words, it's generally calculated, I say generally, we really only have good data for the United States and Canada, but it's generally calculated that super emitters, in other words, the very largest emitters, which can be accidents, they can be equipment failure, these account for about 70% of total emissions, a relatively small number of emissions, and therefore if we can identify and eliminate those sites, we can actually relatively quickly and cheaply eliminate a large percentage of methane emissions. Next slide, please. So the fourth recommendation is that we need procedures for certification of emissions by approved institutions, both national, international, both government and private. And to move to the fifth recommendation, we are not clear, and there are arguments on both sides, as whether it would be necessary to create new institutions for these activities. We already require governments to designate institutions to submit greenhouse gas inventories to the UNFCCC, but the key initial requirement must be more detailed and stringent collection, reporting and verification, in IPCC terminology, tier 3 rather than tier 1 measurement and verification. So the key question here for me is that the more accurate estimates of methane emissions from these fossil fuels would be limited, but a relatively simple and low cost way of informing how greenhouse gas emissions can be reduced and the value of fuel switching. So let me focus now on your question. The problem that we have about fuel switching is that we're only measuring at the moment the combustion element of burning fossil fuels. And we know that coal combustion is roughly twice as carbon intensive as, say, natural gas consumption, with oil somewhere in the middle. And so for several years, the fossil fuel community has recommended that everybody should switch to the extent they can away from coal and towards natural gas in order to reduce emissions from fossil fuel. This may be good for carbon dioxide, but there have been a number of studies, particularly from environmental groups, but also academics, which point out that this takes no account of emissions from the value chains and particularly production. And there's been a particular debate in the United States about emissions from shale oil and gas operations, which of course have been very prevalent over the last decade as production has increased enormously. So we have a whole lot of claims based on very little actual measurement. And the measurements are both from industry and academics and NGOs are disputed. Now, the burden of this proposal is that we have to get agreement on how to measure, how to report, and how to verify these emissions. What we think is that this is not a particularly difficult technical process. There are definitely going to be disputes between the bottom-up and the top-down estimates, but we think these are resolvable. More seriously, unless we get some kind of agreement internationally on how to measure a report and verify these emissions, it's not going to be possible to answer the question that you've posed, and indeed we've posed also in our proposal, which is, does fuel switching really make a big contribution to reduction of greenhouse gas emissions from coal, for example, to gas? Now, we think that probably it does. But again, the burden of this proposal is generalizations are not at all useful. In other words, if you are currently burning coal and you decide to stop burning coal and instead burn gas, you are importing, probably, you may be producing yourself, but you are probably importing pipeline gas and LNG from a particular source. And that source and the value chain that the gas comes through will have an emissions footprint. And you are replacing coal from a particular source, which also has an emissions footprint. And what you have to do is to compare the two footprints and say, do you have a net greenhouse gas reduction from replacing coal with gas? And this is why we need much more accurate data for all fossil fuel production and value chains. So why don't I stop there, and maybe we can, if we have time, explore this in more detail. Thank you, Aisha.
Well, thank you very much, Professor Jonathan. I would like now to move. Thank you, Mary and Professor Jonathan, for highlighting on the importance of the private sector as well as the government in bringing down the greenhouse gas emissions. For Dr. Leila, whose policy brief has highlighted on the importance of empowering the youth in terms of allowing advanced climate action and global energy transition. Yes, we need a collective action if we want to tackle the climate change. We need the government, we need the private sector, as well as the youth in the process. Dr. Leila, you highlighted in your policy brief saying that while youth empowerment via education and awareness would play a significant role in serving global climate action, few countries treat climate and education as mandatory subjects. Would you please let us know more of how could the G20 countries support the youth empowerment through education to enhance their involvement in addressing the climate change? Thank you.
Thank you, Aisha. Thank you, Noura, for having me on this panel. If I'm breaking up or if there's a delay in the sound, because I'm not sure about the internet quality at this point in Beirut.
We can hear you well.
Okay, perfect. So basically we have come up with 4 proposals on how the G20 can help engage youth in addressing climate change. The first one and the most important one is to mandate sustainability and environmental education domestically and regularly track environmental and climate literacy internationally. So although the Paris Agreement in 2015 urges its signatories to implement climate education, it was only after the COP25 that movements began to make climate education mandatory. So we give a few examples in the policy brief, those of Italy, Mexico, New Zealand, and the US, where Italy and Mexico were the most ambitious in terms of making environmental education at the center of their education model. Let me first start talking a little bit about the school level, so primary and secondary. Following the examples of those countries, the G20 should promote education as a tool to combat climate change and raise awareness on environmental problems. One of the main difficulties encountered in providing high quality environmental education in schools in the long run is the lack of political support from the government. And this has been documented in many studies. So encouraging and wherever possible legislating that climate change and environmental sustainability should be incorporated into school curricula at all levels is necessary so that the current and future generations have the tools they need to understand and address climate change and other pressing environmental problems. At the college level, so tertiary education, we expect that change in higher education will be driven by the demands and initiatives of students. So unlike primary and secondary education, as well as those of businesses, as they have begun to recognize the positive impacts of sustainability education in institutions of higher learning on development. The other tool that we mentioned is tracking the progress, which is also very important. So tracking the progress of implementation and achievement is equally important. Across education levels and disciplines, international assessments of environmental literacy are necessary. So this is something that the G20 can come up with a tracking tool, and so develop some indicators and other methodological techniques as well. The second proposal that we make is to invest in environmental education infrastructure and also in educator training. The G20 can prioritize environmental and climate educational capacity building, teacher training, and mentoring, and the development of effective leadership as well. Investments in environmental and climate educational infrastructure, as well as research and development, must be increased to levels that are commensurate with the scale of the problems that we are facing. So in some parts of the world, reliable internet access and electricity supply are still lacking, which makes training extremely difficult. So in those regions without internet access, innovative solar technologies, for example, which are a source of, can be introduced to children with their learning. Another critical component of elevating sustainability education is actually empowering the educators. Many educators know very little about climate change and related sustainability problems. So one of the most effective ways of making a difference in the education of young people is to train these educators and provide them with new skills, tools, and insights. For example, the UNCC, which is the UN Climate Change Learning Partnership, is an excellent initiative that supports the integration of climate change in education by providing teaching material for primary and secondary school educators. G20 states and industries should expand financial support for sustainability education and teacher training and make it a national and international priority. The third proposal that we have is to promote games which draw on real-world problems and develop partnerships for environmental education in local communities. So here, forging partnerships with local communities and businesses can accelerate the adoption of environmental education as a bottom-up initiative that enables the speed and the scale in the transition of knowledge systems, especially in disadvantaged societies with less access to public knowledge and environmental awareness raising initiatives. The development of content for environmental education must be contextualized to suit the needs of the local community while also raising public awareness of the global climate emergency. We include in the policy brief several interesting examples from India and China of games that have been developed. And also beyond formal schooling, other avenues such as online resources, certificate courses, adult to youth mentorships, and theme-based summer camps can also be promoted to help train the youth to become agents of change. Platforms for mutual learning between established and novel climate action movements are necessary, and making board and digital environmental and climate games available to children can also stimulate their curiosity as well. So those are examples of non-formal education tools that can help in engaging youth. And then our fourth proposal is to organize an annual youth summit for climate, environment, and sustainable development solutions. Such a summit could be for climate, environment, and sustainable development solutions, could be supported by and hosted during the G20, and it would give young people the opportunity to meet, engage in focused discussions on key environmental and climate energy topics, and develop solutions to address these serious problems. Actually drawing on and simultaneously going beyond the model of the UN Youth Climate Summit, which exists, the goal of the G20 Summit could be to encourage the development of cooperative solutions to sustainability problems. And in the months leading up to the G20 meetings, those youth selected, usually selected at the national level, can be given 3 critical environmental problems to work on together, for example. And at the G20 meetings, these youth can be given a larger stage to present and highlight their achievements and findings. So if they jointly develop, for example, educational videos or apps to measure and share data on pollution, or there are multiple other ideas. And the summit will be a learning opportunity for young people and will create potentially long-lasting networks for them among next generation leaders. So this would be a platform where they can highlight their ideas and share their innovations and creativity more widely.
Well,
So basically,
thank you very much, Leila.
Proposals that we present in the policy brief. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Leila. I apologize, I have to stop you because we don't have much time. Thank you. So we have few minutes left for this panel, and I would like to go back to you, Mary. You've also got to the point where the G20 could provide a platform for the G20 nations to coordinate their efforts in green energy transition. How do you think the G20 could play that kind of role in coordinating the efforts? Thank you.
Well, thanks, Aisha. As we know, the G20 is quite a nimble organization. It's also a pretty lean organization. So we can't ask it to do miracles. And we believe it has certain competitive advantages, and they include coordination, coordinated action, standards, common principles, and sharing of best practices. So this is what we've built, and what sort of brings together the 3 areas that we're proposing that the G20 focused on in terms of the energy transition. We think that having a coordination platform in the form of a semi-permanent task force established as a matter of urgency is important for building trust among countries, for encouraging thereby higher ambition, capturing commitment also. The UNFCCC and all UN diplomacy at the moment is effectively on a pause. It is very difficult to hold multilateral negotiations with 196 countries online. So there is this capturing commitment dimension as well. And it also would help discourage free riding and carbon leakage if there is certainty and some common principles and certainty that everybody is moving in the same direction. What we realize is that the different G20 engagement groups and the G20, they're operating in a pretty siloed fashion, and the G20, the COVID-19 has of course compounded this challenge. At the same time, mainstreaming decarbonization requires, of course, multi-stakeholder engagement and collaboration. So what we think is that this task force should bring together not just G20 governments, but members from all the key engagement groups, not least business and Think 20, but also civil, urban, labor, and so forth. This would help leverage the knowledge and experience in these groups, promote transparency and accountability of governments, resolve conflicting interests, identify barriers and enablers, and also incentivize policy ownership among all these different stakeholders if they're engaged in the process. So what this would be a multi-year, multi-stakeholder task force focused on the post-COVID sustainable energy transitions. It would meet regularly. It would first build an integrated vision and common objectives aligned with the Paris Agreement and the SDGs. It would then break up and mandate work on policy recommendations on specific energy transition related areas. And then these would be taken up, debated, considered, and endorsed as recommendations for all governments. We're proposing as one of the first areas, and this all needs to happen really soon because governments are very much locking in their stimulus and recovery financing already. Among the first tasks, it could mandate the development of best practices in the power sector along the lines of, as we outline in the paper, growing the green, transitioning the brown, and transforming the rest. So again, this is not an opportunity, it is what we have to do.
Great, thank you very much, Mary. I would like to move to Professor Jonathan with a question. So if we succeed in the implementation of the framework of measuring the methane emissions, the question that begs, how expensive the implementation of that framework is? And do you think that COVID-19 brings an opportunity or otherwise for the implementation of this framework in the short run? If you could answer that.
Thank you, Aisha. I'm possibly the only person on this webinar with a proposal which says that COVID-19 really doesn't make a great deal of difference to what we're proposing here. And the reason it doesn't make a great deal of difference is that we are asking people to measure emissions, and they will be able to do that whether or not there is a pandemic, despite all of the very terrible things that have happened. Let me just rapidly address the costs and benefits. The estimates from the International Energy Agency are that at 2019 prices, at least 1/3 of the measures that will need to be taken will be net negative. In other words, they will be beneficial in terms of costs and benefits. So the costs of putting in place these measures are estimated around $5 billion, and the benefits of capturing lost methane that can be then sold or used domestically will be about $10 billion. Now that is an estimate of 2019 prices, which of course are relatively low. An estimate at 2017 prices were that 45% of the emissions could be saved at no net cost. So what we're looking at is a situation where both the private sector and governments have an enormous incentive financially to put these measures in place. The only thing they have to do is to get their organizations together in order to achieve this. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Jonathan. Also, back to you, Layla. I have one question also, as we are in the COVID-19 era at the moment. Do you think that the proposal that you have in your Pulse brief is possible in the short term, or do you think that COVID-19 could mask that opportunity of integrating climate and environmental science in the education curricula? Thank you.
Thank you, Aisha. So I looked at how COVID has been impacting what is related, to our proposals. So when it comes to formal education, and this includes primary to tertiary, initiatives to give climate education a central role, like the ones we mentioned in the policy brief, Mexico and Italy, and a few other examples. Such initiatives have been delayed due to the COVID-19 impact of slowing, whether it's the work of government institutions, legislative processes, etc. If we look from the school and college perspectives, administration and instructors are now primarily dealing with the challenges of moving to online education and also how to support their students in such a remote environment, and thus have other priorities. And also on top of that, if we factor in the tighter budgets that they're working under, it doesn't look very promising for any progress or expansion in related course offerings. Now, from another angle, there's the accessibility problem, which we mentioned in the policy brief. So we had pointed out that there is unequal access to quality content, education resources, technology, and the internet. And this problem is amplified by the fact that much of the material available is geared towards English speakers and privileged groups. So even in the best performing countries, there are major gaps in knowledge and access to information among students. Now, due to COVID-19, countries are utilizing remote learning mostly and other educational resources to mitigate loss of learning. So this by itself exacerbates ever-present challenges like degrees of accessibility within communities, and hence is expected to negatively affect access to climate education resources as well for those communities. Now, a third angle that I looked at is outdoor learning, and this could be part of a formal or informal education, and it has also been negatively impacted. So basically getting youth outside, connecting with the world around them, and learning about nature have many documented academic, health, and social benefits, and was booming in the past few years. Unfortunately, and according to a study by the Lawrence Hill of Science at the University of California, Berkeley, the COVID-19 pandemic threatens the survival of organizations nationwide that provide critical outdoor environmental and science education to K-12 students, with an alarming 63% of such groups uncertain about their ability to ever reopen their doors. There are a few other also negative statistics. So around 1,000 organizations surveyed will have lost about 600 million in revenue. 11 million kids will not have access to those outdoor learning activities. 30,000 employees laid off, and so on and so forth. I'm not gonna list all of them, but overall, the impact has been negative. Now, on the positive side, some of these programs have managed to adapt in the age of COVID. For example, the Chesapeake Bay Foundation, they have launched a new online environmental learning series designed to be a resource for teachers, parents, and students during the COVID-19 pandemic. This new remote learning series is called Learn Outside and Learn at Home. So it features videos of professional educators discussing environmental science topics. One other
over time, so I really appreciate your thoughts and insights, and thank you very much. I would like to close this session and thanks the panelists for their excellent insights and discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Although we do have an intervention from Axel Makalua, on the same topic.
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much for giving me the floor. So I would just like to raise attention that under the Task Force 11 on COVID, I've been leading a paper on a policy brief ensuring that COVID recovery policies support the transformation to climate neutral society. So of course, we have been giving various recommendations that are fully in line with what Marie was presenting. I just wanted to highlight two recommendations. One was that G20 countries should highlight policies that promote the continuation of behavioral changes acquired during the pandemic, for example, with regards to online communication, meeting and teaching, because that, of course, can generate significant greenhouse gas reductions through avoidance of long-distance travel. And the second recommendation, going into a similar direction, would relate to regulating tourism providers to achieve zero emission and focusing on high value, low impact tourism. So I would just raise these 2 points and of course guide everyone to have a look at this policy brief as well that tries to capture key aspects of the COVID pandemic and climate-friendly recovery. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much, Axel. We appreciate it. So now I would like to move to the next part in the agenda. We have an Italian perspective, and this will be delivered by Professor Marzio Gaglietto, who is a Senior Associate Research Fellow at the Italian Institute for International Political Studies. Marzio is a professor of environmental and energy economics at the University of Milan and a visiting researcher at CAPSERC. He graduated from Bocconi University in Milan and holds a MPhil and PhD in economics from New York University. He is a research fellow at the Center for Research on Geography, Resources, Environment, Energy, and Networks at Bocconi University. Founder and first president of the Italian Association of Environmental and Resource Economists. He has been an expert reviewer of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, 3rd, 4th, and 5th assessment reports for Working Group number 3 on, and the coordinator for the Climate Change Modeling and Policy Research Program of the Foundation. So I will skip this. This is in Italian. He has published extensively in scholarly journals and actively participated to the policy debate through media interviews, comments, articles in newspapers and magazines, and speeches and presentations in non-academic public events. Professor Marzio, it's a pleasure to have you with us, and I will give the mic to you now. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Aisha. Thank you very much, Noura. It is a pleasure for me to be invited here to give a few concluding words at the end of this meeting. I consider it a privilege for at least 3 reasons. The first one is because I represent my country in this ideal passing the witness between Saudi Arabia and Italy. And I also represent one of the most prominent Italian think tanks and internationally known as far as international policy studies, geopolitics, and the like are concerned. The second reason is because I am an author of a few policy briefs myself in the this T20, but I also know many friends and colleagues who have been from CAPSERC, who have been involved in this tremendous effort done by T20 Saudi Arabia, painstaking activity by all authors, organizers, people behind the scenes, as I have personally witnessed when I was visiting the kingdom before the lockdown. And the third reason is a personal one. I'm a climate and energy economist, so it is a nice opportunity for me to close this task force which is devoted to climate change and environment. I would like just to stress briefly two short concepts to close with these concluding remarks. The first one is that Italy, as said, will receive the witness from Saudi Arabia towards the G20, and so will be for the T20. As you all know, Italy is a prominent member of the European Union, And among other things, he shares, actually contributes to determine the European Union climate action. The EU climate strategy, which is common to all member states, has put the fight to climate change at the center of its action, especially with this new commission, and lies at the heart of the European Green Deal. Last April, a proposal by the Commission has been put forth to the attention and the approval of the European Parliament and European Council. The European Climate Action sets the goal of for Europe to become climate neutral by 2050, in line with the latest recommendations by the IPCC. I'm alluding to the special report on warming 1.5 degrees warming. And to that end, it has been setting for all European member countries targets of emission reductions. There is one for 2020, which is about to end, a year, which is about to end. There is another one already set for 2013. There will be a new one for 2040. Now, the target for 2030 has been, according to this new, more stringent and determined European strategy, strengthened because the proposal is to achieve 55% reduction in CO2 emissions relative to 1990 level. Having said this, Italy shares this commitment of the European Union and also shares the ambition of being the front runner in the fight to climate change, in combating climate change, and therefore is determined to proceed in this direction. The second concept is that the European Green Deal states, quote unquote, that climate change is an essential threat to Europe and the world. And within this framework, the Union is committing to use diplomacy, trade, and development cooperation to advance climate action. This work made clear and revealed the awareness, the conviction that multilateralism and international cooperation are key. No effective, efficient, and equitable solution to climate change is possible without cooperation, international cooperation, and the involvement of everybody. Italy's foreign policy has always been inspired by this conviction. So it is an easy get that we will engage in a determined way with the G20 as the group on the whole accounts for 80% of carbon emissions. T20 Italy is ready to do its best and to assist the G20 can help achieve these goals, but obviously not without the valuable support, experience, and advice of T20 Saudi Arabia. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Gagliotti, for this very inspiring and touching remarks with all the personal and professional reasons that you have mentioned. Art is a universal language, transcending barriers of language and time. The T20 uses art to communicate its themes, priorities, and policy recommendations to all. I would like to welcome the Saudi artist Fahad Al-Gathami, who's an artist from Taif. He was born in 1982. He's a multidisciplinary artist using different medium depending on each concept. He believes in the role of art and its responsibilities. Al-Gathami received numerous prizes, such as the Young Artist Forum Award from the Ministry of Culture and Information in 2008, as well as the Souk Ukad Award in 2008. He has also participated in several art exhibitions in Saudi Arabia and abroad. In his artwork, Untitled, Fahad's work speaks to the innate relationship that we have to our immediate environment. His artworks are a complex mix of images and media which aims to express his consciousness about the environment. I leave you with this video of his artwork.
اسم العمل عالم من البلاستيك يتناول زاوية جديدة في البحث والتدوير الفني، تسليط الضوء على جمالية مخادعة بصريا وتفاعليا، حيث أن هذه الكم الهائل من تفاصيل البلاستيك المتنوعة ينطلق من أساس صناعة قالب جمالي فني لأنواع البلاستيك، يقوم على ابتكارها مصممين وفنانين هدفهم تقديم منتج داخل هذا البلاستيك بأفضل يعني طريقة وتقنية ممكنة، ولكنها في لحظة ما يعني تتحول إلى وحش مرعب يهدد الطبيعة والكائنات الحية ويشكل تهديد لمستقبل الإنسان والأرض معا. علاقة العمل بالتبادل الجاري أنه أحد أكثر جرائم البشرية الحديثة التي يشترك فيها الجميع من المؤسسات وأفراد بقصد وبدون قصد، جريمة سوء استخدام هذه المواد.
I would like to give you the floor, Fahad, for talking about this powerful and extraordinary piece of art.
السلام عليكم. مسموع الصوت؟
نعم مسموع، تفضل.
مساء الخير على الجميع. سعيد بالمشاركة مع الشباب في مؤتمر T20، وححكي من منطلق فني. يعني الأخوة ما شاء الله يعني يتكلموا من يعني منطلق دراسي وأكاديمي، لكن أنا بتكلم من ناحية فنية. النواحي أو الدوافع اللي يعني خلتني أتناول هذه التجربة. أنا فهد القثامي، شاب فنان سعودي ابن قرية تبعد عن مدينة الطائف تقريبا 3 كيلو. الطبيعة جزء من تكويني الأسري، وأعني بالطبيعة المزارع والفضاء المفتوح. تعاملنا مع البلاستيك كان في نطاق ضيق جدا، ولدينا يعني أسباب يعني فيها حساسية تجاه هذه المواد، يعني وجودها في الطبيعة أشبه بالتلوث على المستوى البصري. أيضا في نقطة يعني لمستها من خلال بحثي، أنه يعني على مستوى الإنسان البسيط اللي هو راعي الماشية أو لاحظت أنه استشعروا خطر يعني هذه المواد، وكان يعني استشعارهم بطريقة غريزية. يعني هذا الاستشعار أو الوعي البسيط يعادل في اعتقادي الهدف الأسمى لقضية البيئة العالمية. مستقبل كوكب الأرض يعادل في القرية عندنا الخوف اليومي على حياة الكائنات المحيطة والطبيعة. أيضاً لاحظت أنه لهم طرقهم الخاصة في التخلص من هذه المواد رغم أنها بدائية وبشكل يعني دائم. أود أذكر أنه خلال هذا المؤتمر أحب أنه أسلط الضوء على هذا الهاجس القديم لدي. أجده رابط أصيل فيما سبق ذكره والدوافع الشخصية وبين ما أقدمه في هذا العمل، وهو تحت عنوان عالم من البلاستيك، وهو المشروع الأول في تجاربي الفنية في هذا المجال. أعتقد أنه فتح لي أبواب من بينها يعني حتى الانتباه للممارسات الشخصية لدى الفنانين الروتينية ومدى خطرها. مثلا ما يوجد في الاستوديو الفني من أدوات بلاستيكية أقلها التغليف البلاستيكي للأعمال الفنية. هل أتساءل إنه هل يمكن للفنان أن يقدم للمتلقي قصة جمالية وفي نفس الوقت يقدم لكوكب الأرض مخلفات بلاستيكية لا يحرص على التخلص منها يعني بالطريقة الصحيحة؟ أيضاً على المستوى الإنساني المعاش يومياً تطرأ انتباهات صغيرة وفيها مفارقات يعني قد تكون مضحكة، يعني مثلا استخدام العبوات البلاستيكية لشرب المياه التي يفترض أنها تقدم سر الحياة كما يقال، وفي ذات الوقت بعد استخدامها يعني تساهم في تهديد الحياة على كوكب الأرض. فعند الانتباه لهذه التفاصيل يعني نجد أنواع عديدة من المخلفات البلاستيكية تقدم يعني خدمة قصيرة المدى للإنسان الذي استخدمها مقابل يعني ضرر طويل المدى لكوكب الأرض. هذا المشروع يعني معنون بعالم من البلاستيك قدمه اليوم بصورته الأولية مشروع طويل ولا نهائي يساهم فيه عبر الفن بتأسيس توجه فني للتوعية بضرورة الالتفات لهذه القضية التي تتلائم مع رؤية المملكة 2030 عبر برنامج جودة الحياة والبرامج الأخرى تحت هذه الرؤية، والتي تنادي بالحفاظ على البيئة وضمان مستقبل أفضل للإنسان. يجدر بالذكر إنه هذا المشروع يعني علمني إنه ما له نهاية طالما يعني موجودة هذه المشكلة وطالما استمر هذا الخطر. فهذا يساهم إنه أنا أطور في التجربة وأنقلها يعني لمرحلة متقدمة إن شاء الله. وشكرا لكم.
شكرا، يعطيك العافية أخ فهد. عمل مهم ويجسد الواقع بمعنى الكلمة. Thank you very much, Fahad, for this beautiful presentation and concept of such an important and critical subject under climate change and environment. With that, I will pass on the mic to Aisha.
Thank you very much, Noura. It is a great pleasure to have Dr. Fahad al-Turki, the chair of T20 Saudi Arabia, to give the closing remarks for today. I would like to introduce Dr. Fahad al-Turki, who is a Vice President of Research at the King Abdullah Petroleum Studies and Research Center. Dr. Fahad is a board member of the Islamic Corporation for the Development of the Private Sector and a member of the Board of Directors of the Saudi Energy Efficiency Center. He was the chief economist and head of research at Jadwa Investment Company and an independent board member of the General Authority of Statistics. Dr. Fahad has over 20 years experience in economics, including as the chief economist at Barclays, Saudi Arabia, an economic specialist at the Saudi Arabian Monetary Authority, and an economist at the Middle East and Central Asia Department of the IMF. He holds a BA in Business Administration from the King Saud University and master's and PhD degrees in economics from the University of Oregon. Dr. Fahad al-Turki, thank you very much for joining us, and the mic is yours.
Thank you, Aisha, and thanks to Dr. Noura. It's been a very exciting 3 hours today for the Climate Challenge and Environment Task Force, our second task force under the T20, Saudi Arabia, and the largest task force compared to the other, which reflects the importance of the topic, not only for Saudi and the region, but also for the global economy. And we heard Professor Marius talking about also the importance of the issue moving forward under the Italian presidency next year. It's been 3 hours of discussion filled with recommendations and so on. So, but I'm not gonna overwhelm or add more to that. We just want to close with a special thank to Dr. Noura and Aisha for leading this task force, and as well as a special thank to the authors of our policy briefs in this task force and the speakers during this session. It's been a great and exciting discussion today. A special thank to the Institute of Energy Economics of Japan, for co-hosting this webinar, and also contributing to the discussion at all levels, at the policy brief level, as well as the discussion today with Dr. Toyoda participating in the first panel. We are also grateful for our co-leading institutions, CAPSARC, which is hosting the T20 in its facility today, as well as KF-CRIS for their continuous support, and our co-sponsors, Saudia and Saudi Payments, which without their sponsorship, many of our activities will not be as you have experienced. It's been a remarkable year. We are just starting our summit season. This is our second webinar. We will be continuing to go into another 9 webinars, and then the summit days on October 31st and November 1st. I would like to extend a thank to all the T20 team behind the scene. They are in the other room today. They've been working day and night throughout the year to make our meetings, our webinars as smooth as you have experienced today and will experience moving forward, inshallah. Thank you for attending the event today. We had a very good number of attendees today, and I hope that we go out today with these recommendations that will feed into our communique and will be raised to the G20 leaders at their summit in second half of November. I also look forward to meeting you all during next week's webinar, and in particular Task Force 3, which will take place in September 29th on infrastructure investments and financing. So have a great day and see you soon. Thank you.